Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're keeping safe and healthy. Thank you so much for joining us today for the annual fall conference of the Stanford Institute of Human-Centered AI, or HI. The title of our conference today is Triangulating Intelligence, Melding Neuroscience, Psychology, and AI. Personally, intelligence that reflects the diversity of human perception, cognition, and experience is a topic very near and dear to my heart. The intersection of neuroscience and computer science is something that I've worked on since graduate school, and I've devoted much of my professional life to it. So it is very central to the work we do here, also at HAI, the research that aims to develop novel technologies inspired by the depth and versatility of human intelligence. This includes AI inspired by neuroscience, cognitive science, and psychology, novel, unsupervised, semi-supervised, self-supervised, or supervised methods for diverse data types, knowledge, and semantics. The big bet in developing AI is seeking a new synthesis, a meeting of the minds between cognitive science, neuroscience, and AI, which is what we're going to discuss today. This conference exemplifies some of the most cutting-edge research happening in this area of research worldwide. We hope to inspire new developments in this area. And thank you so much for being with us, and please enjoy your day. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the co-organizers of this conference, Professors Chris Manning and Surya Ganguli.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We had nearly 7,000 RSVPs for this event, and we're really excited to have you all here, or at least all of you who have woken up so far, and to have so many of you interested in a deeper dive into human and machine intelligence. I'm Christopher Manning, an Associate Director here at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. I'm also a professor of linguistics and computer science at Stanford University, and I'm the director of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. This is an event that brings together multiple groups at Stanford, and we'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Stanford Wu Tsai Neuroscience Institute, the Stanford Department of Psychology, and the Stanford Symbolic Systems Program. Let me now introduce my co-organizer, Surya Ganguli, Associate Professor of Applied Physics, Neurobiology, Electrical Engineering, and Computer Science here at Stanford. Hello, Surya.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Welcome, everyone. So, of course, we had originally hoped to hold this conference in person last spring, but a few things happened along the way. But this is the third large virtual conference that we've hosted this year. So we're hopefully starting to get the hang of it. And we're pleased that all our keynote speakers have joined us today, and we have a great lineup for you.
Before we begin, a couple of quick logistical items. Please do bear with us if there are any technical glitches during our time together. Unless speakers finish their talks early, you will hear time checks for speakers. And if they go on too long, we may have to cut them off so that we stay on time. If by any chance networking goes down for us or you, please do go to hai.stanford.edu and look for alternative ways to view the conference. Today we have two sessions, the first one with 3 speakers and the second one with 4 speakers. And we'll have an extended discussion section live with Q&A following each session. And then we'll wrap up the day by hearing a bit more about the broader Stanford context for AI, cognitive science, and neuroscience in a final discussion at the end of today's event. We want you to be involved in the discussion. Please go to the conference page on our website. Just go to hai.stanford.edu and click the link for the conference. And there you can type in your questions. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible during the discussion periods. For this event, we're also going to use the Twitter hashtag #NeuroHI, NEUROHAI, all one sequence of letters. If you tweet about talks, we encourage you to use this hashtag so that the Stanford HAI team notice. We'll aim to take brief breaks between the 3 sessions today and try our best to stay on schedule. Human-centered artificial intelligence is about the connection between people and intelligent machines. There are many different aspects of that, including shaping the impacts of AI on society in a positive direction. But today we're going to focus in on the opportunities for synergy between understanding human and machine learning and intelligence. Before we hear from our presenters today, I'd like to let Surya tell us a little bit more about our vision here.
Okay, let's see. Thanks, Chris. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides. So yeah, I just wanted to set up the intellectual themes of this conference. So it's useful to start at the very beginning. Like, how did we all get here today, right? So our story kind of, at least the story of our brain started kind of 500 million years ago when the first vertebrate brains appeared on this planet. And then about 2 million years ago, the first glimmers of human-like intelligence appeared on our planet. And modern humans in their sort of final evolved form appeared about 100,000 years ago. And this is a really remarkable achievement, right? Because currently we have 0 engineering design principles that can explain how a complex communication, control, sensing, memory, and power distribution network like our brains could continuously scale in size and performance over 500 million years without skipping a beat, without ever losing function. We are so far from understanding the theoretical principles governing this amazing feat. So we really have a lot to learn from evolution, even despite the incredible success that machine learning has had in industry as of today, right? So just to set the stage, let's zoom in an order of magnitude discrepancies between what machines and humans can do, right? So, oops, sorry. Sorry, hold on 1 second. I need to share my desktop, I think. Sorry, okay. Sorry, this worked right when I was testing it, so let me try something different. Okay, there we go. So, so one major discrepancy is, of course, the robustness of humans versus machines. We all know about adversarial examples where artificial networks in vision, speech, language, and reinforcement learning can be fooled by illusions that simply don't fool humans. So why do these exist? How does our brain avoid them? How do we make AI more robust? Another order of magnitude discrepancy is energy expenditure, which is becoming very important in industry, right? Modern supercomputers spend about megawatts, 10 megawatts of energy, whereas the human brain spends 20 watts of energy. So our supercomputers consume 10 million times more power than our brain, but cannot do what we can do. A likely problem is that supercomputers are extremely fast and precisely control the flips of digital bits, but the laws of thermodynamics exact a powerful energy cost for every precise and fast bit flip. In contrast, biology is slow and noisy, but just good enough. And so there's, I think, powerful principles that we can glean from biology to create more energy efficient AI. Credit assignment is a major open problem. So just to state it dramatically, here's one of my favorite tennis players from my youth, Ivan Lendl. Let's say, for example, you hit a tennis ball incorrectly. You have 100 trillion synapses. Which one screwed up? How does the brain figure out how to fix the wrong synapses? How does it rewire itself? Neither theoretical neuroscience nor AI can solve this problem adequately at the moment. So, a major open question is, can synaptic physiologists, theoretical neuroscientists, and AI engineers work together to solve this foundational problem? Data hungriness is a major issue. If you look at recent successes in industry, sort of early, and you translate the amount of data that these systems used into human terms, early speech recognition systems use the equivalent of 16 years of someone reading you text 2 hours a day for every day. AlphaGo practiced 450 games a day every day for 30 years. And visual answering question sets are equivalent to receiving answers to about 100 questions about images every day for 274 years, right? So it's clear that humans use much less data to achieve what they do. And so we need better algorithms for learning from unlabeled data, extrapolating information from other tasks to solve a new task. And of course, humans have set up a system of culture and curriculum design to teach humans using carefully sequenced tasks. And we need better ways of doing that in artificial systems as well. Babies also learn very, very differently from humans. There's a famous experiment where if a baby is given, say, two objects, one that in a video magically, when you drop it, it doesn't fall, and another object on a video where magically, if you move it through a solid surface, it can move through that surface. Then you let the baby play with those two objects. The object that didn't fall, it will specifically throw it off the edge of the crib to see if it really doesn't fall. The object that went through solid surfaces, it'll specifically bang it against the crib, right? So this is remarkable. This is saying that even babies, they build complex internal models of how our world evolves. They pay attention to events that violate their world model. They perform active experiments to test their model and gather their own data. They don't just passively receive data. They use the world model to plan and imagine alternate futures. And as they grow up, they can take actions to bring about these alternate futures into being, into reality. Right? We're so far from doing that in artificial systems, though you'll see some examples in our talks today. Okay. So an oft-quoted trope in arguing for why we should ignore biology in creating artificial machines is the analogy, for example, between birds and planes. Now that we have jet planes, it seems almost like folly to build airplanes designed upon the operating principles of birds. But if you unpack this analogy a little bit, you realize that there's multiple problems that need to be solved in making objects fly. Two primary problems are lift and thrust, keeping something up and moving something forward. Of course, airplanes and birds solve the problem of thrust in very, very different ways. Jet engines for airplanes and wings for birds. But the problem of lift is solved in exactly the same way, an aerodynamic wing that creates low pressure on the top and high pressure on the bottom. In fact, our artificial gliders behave very much like gliding birds. So just as there exist laws of aerodynamics that govern all flying objects, whether biological and artificial, and woe unto the object that tries to violate the laws of aerodynamics because it will fall out of the sky, what we'd really like to pursue is an understanding of the fundamental laws and principles that govern how high-level cognition and behavior can emerge from nonlinear distributed dynamical circuits, whether biological or artificial. Of course, AI systems may do some things differently from humans to achieve their end objectives, but there are likely common laws that govern artificially intelligent systems, just as there are common laws that guide flying objects. All right. So if you're interested in more info and thoughts, I actually wrote a blog post titled The Intertwined Quest for Understanding Biological Intelligence and Creating Artificial Intelligence, which you can find on our blog. And there's much more detailed understanding of some of the things that I talked about here. Just to give you an overview of the topics we'll discuss today. So in our morning session, we have an amazing speaker lineup. So in our morning session, we'll start with Matthew Botvinick from DeepMind, who will talk about really melding AI, psychology, and neuroscience. We'll have Dan Yamins talking about alternate methods for learning, especially self-supervised learning from unlabeled data, which was one of the ideas that I mentioned, for visual representations and also other representations. And Dan works both in psychology and in AI. Chelsea Finn has done beautiful work in robotics and meta learning, and she'll tell us how not to create a robot's mind. Knowing not what to do is a very powerful way to zoom in on what to actually do. And then after that, we'll have a panel discussion. Chris and I will have a panel discussion with the speakers. And by the way, we're relying on you for your participation. This is a QR code, which if you scan, you'll be able to go directly to our website, which is right here. And you can write in your own questions. You can vote up or down questions throughout the entire morning and afternoon, and we will see all of your questions, and we'll ask as many of the interesting questions as we can. Okay, in our afternoon session, we'll have a theorist, Sanjeev Arora, talk to us about how we can use deep learning to implement a very serious human value, which is privacy. Yejin Choi, who's done beautiful work on natural language processing and common sense reasoning, we'll talk about common sense intelligence, cracking the long-standing challenge in AI. Ade Oliva will talk about incorporating lessons from cognitive science into AI. And Josh Tenenbaum will talk about some of the scaling issues in terms of how much data we need by looking at alternate algorithms like probabilistic programs and talk about models or game engines in our brain that might govern the way we think about physics and reasoning. And then we'll have another panel discussion with these speakers where, again, we'll take your questions that we'll accumulate and vote upon, that you guys will vote upon throughout the day. And then we'll end with an overall panel discussion. We'll have two very important visitors, Bill Newsom, from our co-sponsors, Bill Newsom, who's the director of the Wu Tsai Neurosciences Institute at Stanford and also a member of the Department of Neurobiology, and Michael Frank, who's a director of the Symbolic Systems Program and also the Department of Psychology. And Chris and I will join them in sort of an overview of a future-looking view of how neuroscience and psychology and AI can work together, and just general thoughts about the day. This should be a lot of fun. Okay, so that's my last slide. So without further ado, I will introduce Matthew Botvinick, who is coming to us from DeepMind, and he will give us our first talk. Thanks.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me? I can't hear anybody confirming.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And you can see my slides now?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, well then I'll just dive right in. Thanks so much for the opportunity to participate today, and I'm honored to be kicking things off. I wish I could have been there in person with everybody on the farm. That's my alma mater, but I'll take what I can get. And I'm going to give a presentation today that I hope will set the table for a lot of subsequent talks, because I'm just going to speak very broadly about my perspective on AI, psychology, and neuroscience, this triangle that the meeting's about. Like Fei-Fei, this triangle has been sort of definitive of my intellectual life ever since I was at Stanford, and I feel like I've spent most of my life now kind of swimming around in this triangle from corner to corner and thinking about how they might all interrelate. I started doing that in academia at Penn and then at Princeton, but over the last 4 years, I've been working, well, I have one foot in academia at University College London, but I spend most of my time at an AI company called DeepMind, which is in London. I haven't actually physically been to London since the COVID thing began, but I'm looking forward to going back there someday and stopping the telecommute that we're all doing. So for those of you who don't know DeepMind, it's an AI company that's involved in a rather diverse set of research activities, but it's perhaps best known for something called deep reinforcement learning, which is a combination of deep learning or artificial neural networks on the one hand and reinforcement learning or reward-driven learning on the other. The first high-profile product of this line of research was in a paper that DeepMind published in Nature in 2015, where they showed how deep reinforcement learning could be used to learn how to play classic Atari games at superhuman levels. And the basic idea is pretty simple. You just take a multi-layer neural network and give it a screenshot, ask it to output an action that one could execute on a joystick, and then you train the whole thing using reward signals, which are based on the points in the game. And this basic approach has been elaborated, quite dramatically and in many ways since then, both at DeepMind and beyond. Some of you may know DeepMind's recent work applying deep reinforcement learning to the much more complicated video game of StarCraft, which was reported in Nature last year. And also work augmenting the deep reinforcement learning formula that I've briefly described already with model-based tree search to attain superhuman performance on complex board games like Go and chess. Further work augmenting deep reinforcement learning with particular kinds of memory systems so that they can engage in structured inference, as in this differentiable neural computer work that was reported in Nature in 2016. And then quite recently, extending deep reinforcement learning to the multi-agent setting in work that we reported last year. Last year, this is deep reinforcement learning agents learning to collaborate and compete in visually enriched environments in the game of Capture the Flag. So that's just a taste of the kind of AI research that goes on at DeepMind. And DeepMind is an AI company. The group that I lead, the members of which are shown here, is nicknamed the Neuroscience team. And we're the one place at DeepMind where neuroscience and cognitive science, psychology research is going on as part of the mix. And we have most of the people involved in the team are doing kind of mainstream AI research most of the time. But there's a little bit of a difference of culture in the sense that most of the people on our team come originally from a background in neuroscience or cognitive science, and a lot of what we do is sort of informed by that background. We've written a few things just generally laying out a perspective on how one might bring these fields together, especially in order to support AI. When I first arrived at DeepMind, I teamed up with the CEO, Demis Hassabis, and a couple of other amazing colleagues to write a position paper for Neuron about neuroscience-inspired AI. And then much more recently, we wrote a review looking at how this paradigm of deep reinforcement learning can be used as a kind of basis for translating phenomena between neuroscience and AI in general. What I want to do is say a few words about the kind of working philosophy that we've arrived at in my group, and give you a quick whirlwind tour of some of the work that approach has led to. So it's been about 4 years of experimenting and thinking about the right way to pursue this virtuous circle among neuroscience, psychology, and AI. And I guess the way that I would summarize the approach we've landed on is that it's fairly opportunistic. It's based on an ongoing dialogue between neuroscience and psychology on the one hand, and AI on the other, without really worrying too much from moment to moment which field you're standing in. Importantly, we try to set things up so that there are a lot of bilingual people working on our neuroscience projects and on our AI projects, so that it's not the transfer of insights is not between people in every case, but sometimes it's happening within one brain. I think that's important. One thing that I want to emphasize is that I believe that the transfer of insights between fields is often subconscious. We tend to focus on a schema of an insight, a concrete insight from one field being transposed to another field. But I think what often happens is that instead, a familiarity with neuroscience will kind of give analogical support for a new idea in AI or vice versa. And sometimes it's even hard to track the origins of these connections. And finally, and this is really the point I want to start with in delving into some specifics, the kind of synergy that we're after between these fields is really just a continuation of something that's been going on ever since AI originated as a field. So let me say something about that. So if you look carefully at the montage of people in my group, you'll have noticed that they're all quite young. And that, as far as I can tell, is true of the general population of people doing AI research these days. And what I've noticed is it means that people aren't always vividly aware of the history of the field in which they're working. So it turns out that a lot of people that I interact with at DeepMind, I get the impression that they think that AI research began in 2012. Which of course is when neural networks came roaring back with a victory on image classification tasks. And one thing I'd like everybody to have more awareness of is that in fact, this kind of explosion of work with deep learning since 2012 really is just the tip of a historical iceberg. And looking at that, like what's underneath the water there, the deeper history of deep learning research makes extremely vivid how the synergy among these fields can play out. So if you go back to the very earliest papers that describe computer implementations of neural networks, they're very explicitly motivated by ideas from neuroscience and observations from neuroscience. If you look at the earliest paper that describes a learning algorithm for artificial neural networks, same thing. It's basically a psychology or neuroscience paper. If you look at the first high-profile report of the epoch-making backpropagation algorithm, which we all use in deep learning research ubiquitously to this day, the first author is a psychologist. And the first explorations of the implications of backpropagation in neural networks were reported in these historically important books called the Parallel Distributed Processing volumes, which were written largely from a cognitive science and neuroscience point of view. And I just want to give a shout out to Jay McClelland, who was one of the key authors in these volumes, and of course is a Stanford professor. One reason that I think a lot of young people believe that AI research and deep learning research began in 2012 is that there was, in fact, a quiet period in neural network research leading up to that. Neural network research used to be referred to as connectionist research, and there was something that some of us refer to as the connectionist winter, where it became very difficult to publish neural network research because other computational paradigms became much more popular. In fact, I have to laugh because this is from a meeting in 2013 where a famous connectionist researcher named Mark Seidenberg presented, and he entitled his talk, "I Remember Connectionism," sort of sardonically. But if you look at the issues that came to the fore, even during that connectionist winter, you see again that they were inspired not only by psychology, but in fact by the same neural network ideas that had been popular just years before. So if you go to Judea Pearl's pivotal book on structured Bayesian inference, which set the scene for a lot of Bayesian cognitive science that took center stage during that connectionist winter, not many people are aware that in fact Pearl's work was inspired by connectionist research by Rummel Hart and McClellan. And of course, in 2012, when neural networks did come roaring back, especially in engineering, neuroscience again played a pivotal background role. So if you look at convolutional neural networks, which were responsible for triggering this renaissance in deep learning, those of us who know the history are aware that in fact they were very directly based on earlier work by Fukushima and others, which proposed neural network architectures that were directly inspired by knowledge about visual cortex in the brain. The same kind of connections exist in deep reinforcement learning. So if you look at the reinforcement learning algorithms that are brought to bear in this work, and in particular temporal difference learning, which is one of the most important, the originators of that algorithm, Sutton and Bartow, started out thinking very specifically about animal learning. This was not a computer science project per se. They were trying to figure out how animals learn in the ways that they empirically do. And of course, temporal difference learning, as many of the people in the audience will know, has since been tracked back into neuroscience as an account of how the dopaminergic system works. One more point along those lines, one of the main things that allowed deep reinforcement learning to work, practically speaking, in the Satari project is something called experience replay, which is a replay of memories and further learning based on that replay that was directly inspired again by neuroscience based on observations about what happens in the hippocampal formation. Very recently, those who keep up on the AI literature will be very aware of something called a transformer model that's been applied in language modeling to great effect recently by multiple groups. And here again, even though these breakthroughs in language modeling are happening very much in a computer science or AI context, if you just go back a little bit, you'll see that the original approach to exactly the same problem was pioneered by a cognitive scientist, Jeff Ellman, who really started the work that's now bearing such amazing fruit in this recent research. So anyway, all of that is just my kind of cranky old man version of a historical perspective. And I like the people that I work with to know that we're just carrying on a tradition. But having given you that historical background, let's talk about what's going on now and the way and in the background of what I'm about to describe. I think you'll see this three-part strategy. Let me tell you about some of the work that we've been doing in my group at DeepMind. Again, kind of trawling these waters, these triangular waters among neuroscience, psychology, and AI. So this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour, and I apologize if it's superficial, but I'd rather everybody get a kind of bird's eye view of the range of things that we've been doing and the flavor of our approach rather than the details of any one project. So let's start with a paper that we published in Nature Neuroscience in 2018, which is closely connected with a review that we published last year in Trends in Cognitive Science, which is about something called meta-reinforcement learning. Here we started with an observation about recurrent neural networks. So a recurrent neural network is just a deep neural network that has connections among its internal units, which allows the system to have memory in its activations, very much like working memory in the brain. What we observed is that if you train a recurrent neural network of this kind using reinforcement learning, that's what the red arrow stands for, you use reward prediction errors to train the network's connection weights. And you trained it to go from visual observations to actions in the standard reinforcement learning way, along with some auxiliary inputs and outputs that we can ignore for the moment. Something very interesting happens if, in addition, you train the system not just on one task, for example, a two-armed bandit problem, but instead a family of interrelated tasks. What happens in that context is that after the system has enough experience with that family of tasks, you can turn off the reinforcement learning algorithm. You can freeze the connection weights in this network. And then when you present the system with a new problem from the same family, it can solve it, even without synaptic changes. So this is just an illustration of a network with frozen weights solving a two-armed bandit task. You can see it exploring left and right actions in an easy problem and a hard problem. And this is just a regret curve showing that the system is doing pretty well on this bandit problem compared to off-the-shelf bandit algorithms that form a gold standard for comparison. So that meta reinforcement learning principle was purely an AI. It was purely an AI observation. But because the people that were involved in this research were bilingual in the way that I mentioned earlier, some of us got to thinking about potential analogies to brain function. And we thought, well, if we know that the dopamine system appears to act in a way that's analogous to this reinforcement learning algorithm we're applying, and we know that the prefrontal cortex has highly recurrent connectivity, lots of loops, then maybe we can think of this recurrent network that we're training as a model of the prefrontal system as it's trained up by reinforcement learning. Maybe the working memory functions of the prefrontal cortex are trained by the synaptic changes that are driven by dopamine. And that's what the paper's about. We show things, for example, like this. If you train a recurrent neural network on a task that has been used in studies with monkeys, you find behavior in the neural network that closely resembles the behavior of the monkeys. And then if you look inside the neural network at what the internal units are coding for, you find a profile of codes that closely resembles what you see in the neuroscience study when electrodes have been placed in prefrontal neurons and their receptive fields have been measured. That's just a quick taste of this work. I encourage you to look at the Nature Neuroscience paper if you're interested in more details. I'll just mention that we've carried forward this work. We have a paper on arXiv that characterizes this meta-learning process in Bayesian, in terms of amortized Bayesian inference. And we're continuing to partner with neuroscientist collaborators in order to show that meta-RL actually provides a better explanation for prefrontal function than some standard reinforcement learning models. That's work that we're preparing to submit soon. But for the moment, let me move on and tell you quickly about another project in which we've kind of trawled these waters between neuroscience and AI. And this is a paper that we published earlier this year in Nature, which is about distributional reinforcement learning and dopamine. So in the AI world, there's been a lot of interest in something called a distributional reinforcement learning algorithm. The idea here is, in reinforcement learning, an important component is making predictions about how much reward you can expect in the future, given where you are now. And the standard approach is to represent that future prediction as a single number. But the distributional approach says, well, what if instead we represent the future expectation in terms of a full probability distribution? So an agent playing an Atari game might say, well, I might make this many points and I might make that many points. Or a humanoid jumping over a chasm might think, oh, well, I might make it over and get a lot of reward, or I might fall in and get less reward. And that distribution evolves over time. What's been found in AI work is that this distributional approach has very dramatic payoffs for performance in reinforcement learning systems. And in the work that we did, we decided to ask again, drawing our kind of bilingualism here, gee, I wonder whether the dopamine system might use a similarly distributed code. Long story short, we found strong evidence in a study that we did in collaboration with Naochita's lab at Harvard that, in fact, you can find parallels. So we studied dopamine activity in a task where mice were given probabilistic juice rewards, and the rewards were drawn from a distribution that was multimodal, shown here in gray. And we were able, using just the activities of the dopamine neurons that were recorded from these animals, to decode or infer the full distribution of rewards that the animals were experiencing. This is something that you shouldn't be able to do. In modeling work, we showed you shouldn't be able to do this if the dopamine system were operating in a classical fashion. But of course, if it's operating in a distributional fashion, then you should be able to decode this, this distribution of rewards. And that's one of the things that we found. Again, many more details in that Nature paper, but in the spirit of this whirlwind tour, let me move on to another example. This is work that actually we just put on arXiv. It hasn't been published yet. I think it'll connect closely with what I anticipate Dan Yamins will be talking about in his presentation. So I'm excited to kind of put it on the table here alongside the cool work that he'll describe. And this is work that was led by Irina Higgins at DeepMind in collaboration with Doris Tsao at Caltech. The basic idea here is to draw on an unsupervised learning architecture that's been of great interest in AI recently, called a beta variational autoencoder, or beta VAE. And the short story here is that this learning architecture uses an objective function that encourages an internal representation that discovers disentangled features. So if you train it on pictures of chairs, and a single internal unit in the system will end up coding for the type of the legs on the chair. And a different internal unit will code for the overall type of chair. And a different internal unit will code for the rotation of the chair. And these disentangled features depend very much on the nature of the data on which the system is trained. So if you train it on faces, it'll discover disentangled features for faces, for example, hair color and so forth. So again, in this kind of using our bilingualism, we decided to ask, gee, I wonder whether the visual system in actual brains might discover disentangled features of this kind. And since we have this AI model, we can do a direct comparison to the codes that are observed in visual neurons in a primate brain on the one hand, and individual units in a beta VAE on the other. Long story short, we find a close correspondence. So looking at neural activity in face patch in macaques, we find that the activity of individual neurons tracks very closely with individual units in a beta VAE trained on exactly the same visual data. And in fact, the one-to-one matching using a variety of ways of measuring this is much closer for the beta VAE for many other deep learning models, including both unsupervised or self-supervised and supervised varieties. Again, no time to go into the details, but hopefully some of you will check out the archive paper. So the work that I've described so far is very much about taking ideas from AI and dragging them into neuroscience. Let me talk very briefly about a couple of projects where we've gone the other direction and taken insights from psychology and neuroscience and tried to bring them into AI. And I'll be very brief and superficial here because I only have limited time. But again, the purpose is to give you an overall flavor. So one thing we have a pretty good idea of from psychology and neuroscience is that the visual system carves the world, the visual world, up into discrete objects. So very strong evidence for this was shown in classic work by Egli, Driver, and Rafal, using an attentional cueing paradigm. Many of the psychologists in the audience will be familiar with this classic work. In neuroscience, it's received convergent support from studies by Rolfsma and others in the primary visual cortex, showing that entire objects are selected by attention as wholes and in parallel. We have the opportunity to experiment with whether this might help in our AI systems now, because we have new unsupervised learning algorithms that can pick out discrete objects in visual data. For example, a system called Monet that's come out of our group at DeepMind, but now there are a variety of algorithms that can do this. And in the work I'll briefly describe, we take this ability to carve out discrete objects, and we combine it with another insight from cognitive psychology, which is that visual scenes are represented not only in terms of objects, but in terms of relations among those objects. And here we have the benefit of recent deep learning architectures that are relational in nature, like these transformer architectures that represent ordinarily words given their larger context. But what we can do is we can combine that relational representation and apply it. We can combine it with object identification and apply it not only to language data, but now to visual data as well, putting in objects instead of just words into those slots. So I'll briefly describe in 3 minutes 2 projects where we've used this strategy. One is a project led by Luis Pilato, which is about intuitive physics. Here we were inspired by developmental psychology, where an understanding of intuitive physics in young children is probed by looking at what surprises them, basically showing them magic tricks that violate the laws of physics and seeing whether they're surprised as a way of telling whether they understand what should have happened based on the ordinary laws of physics. And what we did was we created a data set that's very much like the violation of expectations videos that are, or events that are shown in these developmental studies. For example, showing ordinary physical events, illustrating something like directional inertia, and then also magic tricks for comparison. We wanted a system that would be more surprised by the magic tricks. Another phenomenon that we studied in this work is something called continuity, again, drawing on developmental psychology work. Here's an ordinary physical event in our data set. Here's the magic trick, which we want to be surprising. Object persistence, dropping a board on an object. And in the magic trick, the board goes all the way to the ground. Again, drawing on classic findings from developmental psychology. We trained our system on free-form physics data. So we didn't train it on these phenomena. We trained it on a much more general set of videos. And we use this strategy of carving the visual data up into objects using unsupervised learning, and then using a relational architecture in order to represent those objects in a context-dependent way. I won't go into the details of the architecture, but suffice it to say that that was the overall strategy. And what we find is that using this approach, we get very robust surprise effects across 5 phenomena or concepts that have been studied in the developmental literature. And that's what the bars in green here show the results from Lewis's architecture, which he nicknamed Plato. But importantly, a set of very closely matched baseline models that did not use an object-based representation showed much less clear surprise effects, suggesting again that an object-based representation, like the one we see in the brain, is useful for learning intuitive physics. Okay, 1 more minute, and I'll just briefly give you a sense of another study that we've just recently completed, which uses a similar approach to do visual question answering. This is based on a very cool data set just published by Josh Tenenbaum, Pushmeet Kali, one of my colleagues at DeepMind, and others. And the work on our side was done by David Ding and some other colleagues who are truly amazing. The data set involves videos and a variety of questions that the system has to learn to answer. Some of these are descriptive, some are explanatory, some are predictive, and some are counterfactual. What would have happened if? The work that originally reported this data set used a very elaborate architecture that has a Python module that executes programs that generate the data in order to do inference. And what they showed was that baseline models had a lot of difficulty with counterfactual questions and predictive questions, but their neurosymbolic system did a bit better. What we showed briefly in the work that I'm going to just wrap up describing right now is that when we use an object-based and relational deep learning model without a symbolic component beyond that, we actually do much better. So again, deep learning based on objects and relational representations, as inspired by neuroscience and psychology, does really well in these structured domains. Okay, one final word with going over 30 seconds with your indulgence. Hopefully I've given you a sense of the approach that we're taking trawling these waters. I just want to add one more point, which is that we're getting excited about not only exploring neuroscience and psychology, but also social science. So we've published a bunch of papers lately looking at multi-agent reinforcement learning, comparing it to what happens in human groups in things like sequential social dilemmas. And we're beginning to think that this is a very important area of study if we want to understand how AI systems are going to interact with humans when they're deployed in the real world. Obviously, something that's very central to the HAI paradigm at Stanford. So looking forward to talking about that maybe a bit more in the discussion. And that's it. Thank you.
Hey, all. Thanks so much, Matt. So we're going to take a couple of minutes break, and we're going to switch the video to YouTube because I think it will improve a lot of people's video quality. So just hold on a bit, and the live stream should be up again in a couple of minutes. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So sorry for the glitches that we had. So we've switched to YouTube. I just encourage you all, just to be safe, to refresh your browser. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Daniel Yamins. He's an assistant professor here at Stanford of computer science, and also he's a faculty scholar of the Woodside Neurosciences Institute. So Dan, please unmute yourself and share your presentation and take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'll also say that I'm a member of the psychology department at Stanford as well. So that's an important part of our triangle here, neuroscience, psychology, and AI. And in fact, in the Stanford Neuro AI Lab, which I direct, we work on sort of these two mutually reinforcing goals. One is the idea that understanding brains and human cognition will allow us to build better AI and machine learning techniques, and vice versa, that those techniques will in turn allow us to make better models of cognition in the brain. So in practice, what that means is we build neural networks to solve challenging cognitive problems and then use those models to make quantitative predictions about brain data. My talk will be in two parts. Part one, we'll talk about AI helping neuroscience, and part two, we'll talk about the other direction. So let's work on first on AI helping neuroscience. A core problem in cognition is the very simple problem, it seems, of visual understanding, basically being able to take input images in and understand what's in them. The brain areas that are thought to support this are part of what's called the ventral cortical pathway. So images come in on the retina, they get processed through a series of hierarchically arranged brain areas like V1, V2, V4, IT, and by virtue of doing that, support high-powered visual cognition by the time the data hits in inferior temporal cortex, or IT, at the top of this pathway. As a result, from a computational neuroscience point of view, a very natural idea is to build a quantitative model of neurons in that system. It's no news to anyone at this point that a natural way to do that is to use convolutional neural networks, which were actually originally built so as to condense the rough neuroanatomy of the ventral stream, both in terms of its being hierarchical and its being retinotopic. So of course, how do you actually produce a convnet that looks like the brain? Well, the natural strategy that we have found so particularly useful is to optimize the network for performance on a task, like say, 1000-way ImageNet categorization, and then compare it to the brain on a unit by unit basis. And it turns out that if you do this, neural responses in the brain, in this case, this is to a face neuron, a neuron that responds high to face images, that's the black line, is well predicted by the neurons in the top hidden layer of a neural network that is solving a categorization task. So this neuron is one among many, but if you actually look at among a lot of neurons, you see that these kind of task-optimized convolutional neural networks are today's by far best models of neural responses in the visual system. And you know, when you take a model that's appropriately deep with about the right number of areas to actually match the progression of visual areas in the brain, that not only do you see that higher cortical areas are matched by higher layers of the model, where high level of abstractions are done, intermediate cortical areas are matched by intermediate layers of the model in this kind of amazing way that these layers in the middle that are hard to understand what they actually do. Nobody really knows what the features are in English, but nonetheless, these intermediate layers are matched by the functionally optimized models. And early cortical areas, which are thought to compute such things as edges, are matched by the earliest layers. So there's really this very strong correspondence between both sort of the neuroanatomical or virtual neuroanatomical structure and the features that come out of these deep neural networks. Now, of course, you might say the deep neural networks are kind of like black boxes, but I push back on that by saying that there's really some key principles in this kind of goal-driven modeling idea. One of them is that you start with an architecture class, you have a task or objective, there's a data set, and a learning rule. Our theory of the visual system, in some sense, at this point, is to say that the correct architecture class is the set of convnets, convolutional neural networks of reasonable depth. The task or objective is something like multi-way object categorization. The data set is something like ImageNet images, and the learning rule is some combination of evolutionary architecture search and filter learning through something like gradient descent. And those is a way of a machine learning way of saying it, but each of these ideas can also be given a neuroscience idea, with the idea of thinking of the architecture class as a kind of circuit neuroanatomy, the task or objective as a kind of ecological niche, the data set as something like the environment, and the learning rule is something like a combination of natural selection and synaptic plasticity, with this flow being that essentially you pick the right architecture class so that you can solve the ecological niche situated in the proper environment and update parameters that change the system according to the learning rule. So, this principle has been really useful at thinking about lots of things in terms of not just the visual system, but auditory system, and parts of the motor system. It's been very successful, actually, in a certain sense. But it actually has some very substantial problems, which drive a lot of the ways in which I think that future progress is happening. And many of these relate to what Surya and Matt have talked about. So on the one hand, there's something wrong in the architecture class, which is that everybody knows that the visual system has lots of recurrence and feedback. That's definitely not present in the feed-forward models that I've showed you. But why? What are those connections for? Maybe an even bigger problem is that too much labeled data is required in training object categorization like tasks. That's one Surya certainly mentioned. So the task or objective is somehow broken. Of course, these things are trained in data sets like ImageNet, not on the real noisy video data streams that real organisms have. And finally, backpropagation is well known to be non-biological in a variety of ways. So what I'm going to do is talk about solutions to some of these problems as part of the way that AI has been able to really, I think, help us get a better handle on neuroscience, going beyond just the basic equation of CNNs and the visual system. So as I mentioned a moment ago, real neural networks, that is to say, the ones in the brain, are full of feedback, both long-range recurrence and local recurrence. On the other hand, feed-forward structures can't produce non-trivial dynamics. Basically, they can just make square waves. But real IT population dynamics in the brain, in the part of the brain called IT, actually are useful. In other words, they are able to show that different images are solved at slightly different times. And the reason for this is that essentially hard images get solved late, whereas easy images or control images get solved earlier, right? So what this really suggests, all these things together suggest, is that we should convert from convnets to convolutional recurrent networks, not just feed-forward, but have some kind of recurrence. And that recurrence should be both short local, as in the green arrows, and long-range feedbacks from area to area, as in the red arrows. And if you do this, it turns out that if you build a sort of shallow feed-forward network with about the right number of areas as the brain, you do so well on ImageNet performance, that's fine. If you make the model a lot deeper, which is definitely not how we think the brain does it, you can improve performance a lot. With standard forms of recurrence, such as LSTMs, you can do okay at augmenting performance, although in this case, most of the performance is due to having additional parameters. But if you have the right types of local recurrent structures and the right types of long-range feedback, so reciprocal gated units and long-range feedbacks, you can actually very effectively convert space into time and make shallow recurrent networks that have about the same performance as substantially deeper feed-forward networks. So of course you can then ask, okay, do those local recurrences and long-range feedbacks, do they not only give you improved image performance, do they also give you better predictions of neural dynamics in the visual system? So I mentioned these sort of challenge images and easy images before. The challenge images are the ones that are hard to solve for computer vision systems, and they get solved later by the brain, about 20 or 30 milliseconds later by a macaque. The question is, how well do conv-RNNs do at making predictions about when the images are solved? It turns out on this plot of fraction of the hard images solved versus ability to predict IT neural dynamics, that convolutional recurrent networks are by far better there, even than the deepest feed-forward networks. Deep feed-forward networks can solve challenge images, but they have a hard time correctly predicting when those challenge images are going to get solved the way that the real brain does. And the convolutional recurrent networks do well at that. And in particular, the way they do well at that is that unlike shallow feed-forward networks, which don't do well in performance, or deep feed-forward networks, which do well in performance, but have a large number of units, convolutional recurrent networks are this really good sweet spot between having very high performance, but doing so with a very small number of units. So that is to say, they can actually fit in the head. The idea being that recurrence is being used to achieve this trade-off between performance and practically being able to be physically managed. So, results like this, among many others, say that we're perhaps not okay. We haven't quite nailed down this very deep problem, but I think we're getting towards okay-ish, which means that models are being harder to reject out of hand. Of course, that doesn't address these other problems, so I'll talk a little bit about that now. The second of these problems, which is really about the supervision problem Surya mentioned, others mentioned, this is a very deep problem because there's really just no way that creatures like this receive millions of high-level semantic labels during training. Right? So some form of semi or self or unsupervised loss functions have to be produced that are realistically costly, but that actually, solve the task. Right? So like to put this more succinctly, imagine you had like head cam data from a child, right? Like infants aged, say, 6 to 32 months, such as data from the SACAM data set from Mike Frank's group here at Stanford and others. Data that's just like recording what they're hearing and seeing. How would you use a data set like this to learn a representation, right? That's a really challenging problem because there's no labels associated with that. There's a long history of unsupervised learning, autoencoders among them, which basically have the ability to take inputs in, produce those inputs out. And it turns out that if you build a shallow version of this with a sparseness penalty on the intermediate layer, you get things that look a bit like V1 area in the brain. But unfortunately, it's really hard to use autoencoding in general because you're constantly fighting sort of triviality. And in general, it's very difficult to produce deep networks that have wide range of good features for this for large numbers of categories of objects. There's other types of approaches to unsupervised learning, like things basically using the ability to project out information and then fill it back in. Like, for example, predicting context in images or learning features by inpainting, or one of my favorites is image colorization. You essentially take a grayscale image and color it. You knew what the colors were, so you could do that. And this forces representations to actually be pretty good, because to be able to say, get the right color, you have to know where the boundaries are, and you kind of have to know what the objects are to get the colors in the right place. But these methods have also been limited in terms of their ability to really predict, produce deeper networks and be able to take advantage of those structures to improve performance to anything like supervised levels. More recently, there's been some really serious progress in this in the last 2 years or so in the domain known as contrastive embeddings. Essentially, what these contrastive embeddings do is they have something like the ConvNet, but instead of training them to solve categorization problem, what they do is in various different ways try to train the networks to produce embeddings that push similar things closer together and not quite so similar things further apart. Various methods here have done quite well, producing unsupervised structures and embeddings that learn things that look like sort of proto-categories. And in fact, today's state-of-the-art unsupervised results on ImageNet produce transfer to ImageNet that are substantially better than, say, supervised AlexNet, which was one of the things that kicked off when it's supervised the deep learning revolution. But in fact, now with unsupervised methods, we can do substantially better than even the supervised AlexNet. So that's very powerful, and it works by not only increasing from these deep contrastive embeddings ability to do things like categorization, but also other tasks like object position or object size or things like that, where in fact you can actually see that because of their generality and non-task specificness, then when asked on transfer tasks to non-categorization tasks, unsupervised networks can do as well or better than the category supervised networks. So that's really powerful. Of course, it then raises the question of how well these match neural data, and you can use the same types of techniques I briefly mentioned earlier to compare to categorization-based networks. And there it turns out that if you do this, the older unsupervised techniques, which performed less well, do not so well at predicting neural response patterns, but these more recent deep contrastive embeddings do quite well here. And in fact, the best of these is better at predicting neural response patterns even than supervised categorization-based networks. So finally, really being able to build quantitatively accurate unsupervised models of a higher brain area. And this is true not just in, say, IT, but across the visual system. So predicting models of V1, V4, IT throughout the entire ventral hierarchy. Of course, you would like to operate these things not just on ImageNet. The things I just showed you were in ImageNet, not with the labels, but with the images of ImageNet, which is a strong data set. But really what you get is data that looks more like this, where objects are not framed, and really what you have is the real visual experience of children. And it turns out that if you build a video version of contrastive learning on the types of data that come from something like the SACAM data set, this head-mounted infant data set, that actually now we can start to really build networks that achieve almost the same ability as on framed data, like ImageNet, but with these completely naturalistic, noisy data streams. So that's really beginning to say that at this point, you know, not only are we able to make unsupervised models that predict neural responses, we can actually do so from the real data streams the organisms get. And by virtue of that, maybe begin to have a possible reasonable model for actual developmental trajectories. Of course, that's a big thing to ask off in the future. But what I would say here is that sort of taking together these second and third problems, the issue of not needing mega labels and being able to do so on real videos from real developmental data streams, that these big problems in thinking about the visual system have started to become basically okay-ish, if not exactly okay. So, you know, I think that means that AI has really been able to help us nail down some of the biggest problems in trying to build links between, stronger links between neuroscience and, you know, and computational techniques. I'm not going to talk about the learning rule. That's something, that's a discussion for another day entirely. But what I would say is to take away here is that there's been a lot of progress in terms of using better AI and ML techniques to understand brains in this much more realistic way. So I'm going to now shift gears and spend the rest of the time talking about the opposite direction. So thinking about how cognitive science can help us build better AI, and then maybe eventually better models of neuroscience. So the underlying idea here is very similar to what Matt was talking about, which is essentially you've got an agent in an environment. That agent can be a baby or it can be a machine, whatever. Of course, it takes in and does perception of information from the environment and it acts back out on it. In that context, one of the key things that you want to be able to do is understand how the agent can build a world model. That is to say, learn how, given if I take a given action or given what I see in front of me, even if I don't take an action, what's going to happen next? Okay. And of course, you might wonder why you should learn models, but I think that learning world models is something that obviously is useful from a whole variety of points of view, like having compact abstractions of high bandwidth sensory inputs or the ability to plan across long temporal horizons. This is just a very clearly useful thing to be able to do. In other words, in some way, what you'd like to be able to do is minimize a loss function where you're predicting the future given the current state. But of course, pixel prediction, that's a very natural thing to do, is very hard. I mean, there's been some progress made by folks like Chelsea, and I'm sure she'll tell you about some new stuff there. But it's challenging to do. So for example, you know, a very natural method, some of the most recent methods on this, if you have some trouble. So if you basically show them a scene of this where you've got a couple of objects, this blue low resolution objects in this simple room, acted on and you move your head, the ground truth of what you should see looks like this. You basically, one of the action objects goes out of the frame and the frame moves around. But what predictions will often look like is like this. So essentially quite good at some aspects of it, but losing some of the key things like the objects themselves, right? And so, you know, in work that we have started to do, we've started to really try to tackle how to think about this in a more naturalistic, cognitively reasonable way. So in particular, you know, principles coming out of cognitive science tell us that infants are very good at object permanence. In other words, they understand that if you see an object that's going to continue and it's going to be there even if it's behind something, that turns out to be really hard to train sort of standard convolutional 2D structures to do, even if they have some kind of memory in the form of RNNs. They have real trouble learning object permanence. 3D structures may be a little bit better, but they're very inefficient. And so an alternative that's maybe a little bit more cognitively salient is to build things in the form of graph-based priors. And so there's been a lot of work at using graph-based priors to represent objects. These are still kind of convolutional in nature, but now the convolutional is on the graph. And so as I say, these have been used to do some simple physical prediction problems like 2D bouncing balls. Of course, one would really like to be able to produce much more complicated things such as scenes of objects with complicated objects. And we've done work to try to push the you know, graph-based metaphor towards that. So in particular, scenes where you think about the nodes as corresponding to particles between the objects and edges corresponding to the relationships between them. Of course, humans don't think about all the particles at once in a scene. So what you really have is a hierarchicalization where nodes at higher levels represent kind of composites of things at lower levels. And that graph convolution is replaced with hierarchical graph convolution to allow you to mostly ignore low levels when doing the high level interaction computations. I won't get into the details of how to think about intuitive physics as a kind of graph computation, but what I will say is that if you build hierarchical relation networks and train them to predict the future given the current state, they can learn very good representations of how physics actually works in a way that is comports with, something about the way what humans can predict. So things like the ability to predict like a bouncing cone, or a complex rigid object interacting with the world, or a rigid sphere rolling out of a bowl. This is a sort of complex interaction between objects, or a floppy teddy bear bouncing off the floor and recovering. Each of these is a comparison of a ground truth to the prediction of a kind of hierarchical relation network and thinking about things in the world. Knocking over an unstable block tower or folding cloth. The idea being here that basically for a whole variety of material types, interactions of various kinds can be represented. And make good predictions about the future in a way that sort of naturally builds in object permanence, because after all, the nodes of the graph are the objects. Of course, while that's quite successful, it leaves the big old computer vision problem of how you actually extract a graph description of that kind from real world video, right? So that's an obviously big computer vision problem, and we've begun to do work on that with colleagues in trying to learn physical graph representations from visual scenes. So, of course, at the end of the day, what this means is taking images like the one on the left and being able to produce descriptions of what's going on there in some kind of graphical and 3D integrated way. So like a scene that will have a floor and the walls, as well as the cone and the ball. And that's what we do with things like the physical scene graph, or PSG net. So that not only should it be able to have a representation of the objects, but also of low-level things such as the 3D graph structure. And when you have this graph structure, what you can do with it is a lot. Like you can go back and segment the image, or you could produce a semantic description, or indeed predict intuitive physics, much like I was describing in the previous work. And to do this requires, some substantial additions to the convolutional domain. So in particular, we start with the convolutional RNNs, like I mentioned a bit earlier, use the features from that to do graph construction, that is to build the graphical model of the world, and then learn it in a self-supervised way by rendering back those structures onto the world. I don't have time to talk about the details of the feature extraction, but as part of this graph construction process, there are a couple of key new kind of operations there, including a learnable graph pooling operation, which basically takes in convolutional recurrent features and figures out how to bind things together, and a learnable vectorization that summarizes the properties of objects so that over a wide range of points, they can become single nodes that are bound together. So one key fact about this type of PSG net structure is that not only can it work on kind of synthetic images, but actually allows us to produce very substantial improvements on real world photographic images in terms of self-supervised scene understanding. So that's the sort of key thing, is that it's not just limited to very synthetic domains. It can produce really powerful scene understanding on real world images, as well as being sort of compositional in nature. So, given an input, you can do things like delete an object, or move an object around, or scale or rotate it by operating on the latents. Of course, in the long run, what we want to do is bring this back to, from an engineering point, back to making models in physics. And from a neuroscience point of view, what we would like to do is make comparisons back to parts of the brain that we currently do not. So in other words, in the long run, build a sort of integrated dorso-ventral model beyond just the ventral stream that I've talked about. I'll just wrap up on the last bit by talking briefly about the idea that in addition to wanting to build a system that solves the world model, what we really would like to do is solve both the world model and the policy problem of how do you actually gather good data, right? So in work with some colleagues here, what we have done is build models that have two basic components. So not just the world modeling system that learns to predict the environment, but also a self model that learns to predict the own world model. And by virtue of that, embody a kind of curiosity or intrinsic motivation principle. And then this intrinsic motivation principle, the self model directs the agent towards interesting actions, which in turn allow it to learn better world models and therefore have better curiosity. And if you implement this in a context of a baby agent playing in the world, and build and learn neural networks for each of the components that I mentioned a moment ago, actually what turns out is that a whole series of standard but powerful developmental phases arise. So in particular, the agent first learns about its own motion, the consequences of its own motion, but eventually gets bored, and by virtue of being bored, starts to play with objects in the environment, noticing and playing with the objects and looking at them more, even though no notion of object was built in. And by virtue of this, gets much better at solving world modeling problems, and also, in fact, developing simple planning behavior, like if the object is not in view, turning to find one, if it's too far, moving toward it, and finally staying with it. And it turns out that if you do these kinds of things, not only do you do better at solving the world model prediction problem with these kinds of curious-based policies, but you also start to generate very interesting behavior, like the agents learning to bring objects together so you can bang them, which is a very natural a baby-based kind of behavior. In the long run, what we really want to do is capture intuitive physical play through a series of systems: the computer vision system, the dynamics prediction, and the coupling in of the curiosity-driven policy, and eventually bring those back to how to learn, more robust robotics models, with the idea of being building, better working forward predictors, better models of early childhood physical play, and better ingredients for robotic-based, model-based control and planning. I won't have a chance to tell you as much about social or multi-agent interactions, but I'll just leave you with the idea that it's possible to also apply these kinds of curious intrinsic motivations to learning how agents pick up on animacy and interact with other agents. Essentially the idea being that animate attention is something that arises from a young age. How is this happening? How do the organisms learn to compute this? Our hypothesis that we've done work on recently is that static stimuli that are not agents are sort of boring. Random stimuli are too complicated and pointless to predict, but animate stimuli are kind of in this sweet spot in the middle that allows intrinsic motivations that seek to measure and maximize progress, that is improvement over time, to both be interested in animacy and also good at predicting agent behavior. And I won't have time to tell you about the whole thing there, but what I will just leave you with is the idea that one can start to begin to apply these techniques not only to making better systems for automatically generating animacy, but also comparing them to real human gaze experiments in terms of which types of things humans spend time on and thereby learn about, in particular that they're much better at detecting animate stimuli. So I will wrap up with just reminding you that, what we do in our group here is we try to build better AI systems and have those in turn make better models of cognition and neuroscience. And we've also really started to repurpose ideas from cognitive science to make better models of artificial intelligence. So thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dan, for a very interesting talk. I'd just like to again remind everyone that you can submit questions for any of our speakers by going to the event page on our website. And our next speaker is Chelsea Finn. She's an assistant professor of computer science and electrical engineering at Stanford. We're very lucky to have her here. Welcome, Chelsea, and it looks like you've unmuted yourself and you shared your presentation. All right, take it away, thanks.
Thank you for the introduction, Surya. So today I'm going to be talking about how not to create a robot's mind. And I'd like to actually start with a bit of a story of recent history. Like Matt mentioned, there's a deep history of deep learning, including in robotics, but success was limited to relatively simple problems. So I'll start my story in 2015, which is when I worked on the first project that tried to use deep learning to allow robots to learn complex manipulation tasks from scratch through trial and error. And here's kind of the final learning algorithm that we developed. In particular, we were aiming to train a neural network that mapped directly from images taken by the robot's camera to torques applied at the robot's joints. And what you can see here is at the beginning of the learning process, the robot hadn't learned, didn't really know anything about the world, was starting from scratch, and so forth. And over time, through trial and error, the robot is able to improve and make progress on this task of placing this red block into the shape sorting cube, and ultimately figure out how to solve the task for different positions of the cube. And here's an example of the final policy where you could also see the first person view point of the robot shown in the bottom right. So we succeeded at our goal of learning end-to-end a neural network that can map from images to torques. And we were really excited about this, not because we had a robot that could play with a toddler's toy, but because we had what we thought was a general purpose reinforcement learning algorithm that could enable a robot to solve a wide range of tasks. The robot could use the same algorithm to place the claw of a toy hammer underneath a nail. It could use that algorithm to screw a cap onto a bottle. And a slight extension of this method could also enable a robot to use a spatula to lift an object into a bowl. Now, and this last task is actually quite challenging because the robot has to fairly aggressively maneuver the spatula underneath the object. Not only were we really excited about what we were able to accomplish, but it was also at the forefront of the press, with the New York Times writing that it represented a significant advance in robot learning to train a two-armed robot machine to match human dexterity and speed in performing these tasks. And the new approach included a powerful artificial intelligence technique known as deep learning. Further, beyond the press, not only were we excited about this, but part of the research community was also excited about it, building upon the algorithm to allow their own robots to learn other tasks, like hitting a puck into a goal, like opening a door, and throwing an object to hit a target. Also, like Matt mentioned, there was also simultaneously work on applying the same flavor of deep reinforcement learning algorithms to video games, board games, and simulated legged robots. So I would argue that this is where the state of the art was in 2016 for developing intelligent embodied systems. And at the time, it also seemed like to many that these systems had the potential to have a substantial real-world impact. But we have a big problem. The problem is that the robot didn't learn how to use spatulas to lift objects, and it didn't learn how to hit pucks into goals. The robot learned how to use that spatula to lift that object into that bowl. And if you gave it a different spatula, or if you changed the tablecloth, the robot wouldn't be able to succeed. The entire universe of that robot was that one environment with that one spatula. You may say, okay, maybe we can just give the robot more spatulas and it may be able to generalize more broadly. And in many ways you would be true, but this is perhaps missing the point. These systems are analogous essentially to training a baby to use a spatula before they've learned anything else about how the world works. And from this standpoint, it seems ridiculous to think that we would get an intelligent robot mind as a result of this training process. So clearly, if we're aiming to develop intelligent robots, we need to go back to the drawing board and fundamentally rethink our approach. So how do we do this? Well, one way to look at our current problem, is from a machine learning perspective, is that our training data distribution looks something like this on the left, and ultimately we want our distribution to look more like what's on the right, something broader. For example, we're currently training our robots in a lab environment, and we want our robots to be able to generalize and operate in the real world. So how do we try to bridge this gap? One natural reaction is, well, I know a lot about spatulas. I know how to use spatulas in a variety of different ways. I know how to operate in the real world. Can I build my knowledge into the algorithm to help the robot? For example, can I build in my knowledge of physics, my notion of objects, develop certain architectures and so forth? And I think that this might not be quite the right approach. And this is for a couple of reasons. While we humans are good at generalizing, we don't know exactly how we do it. There's kind of the whole field of neuroscience and cognitive science is devoted to this, and hopefully we'll learn more from the talks today about how we do this. But even if we do know how we generalize, we also don't know how to program that knowledge into these AI systems. That's the approach of symbolic AI that has kind of a long history of not being quite as successful at these kinds of problems. So can we do better? I think that another way to approach this problem and to look at this problem and to actually learn from the way that humans learn is to instead look at kind of a higher level. We know that humans accumulate and learn from broad data and broad experiences by exploring the world, interacting with many different objects, trying out many different things. And so if we want robots to be able to develop more general levels of intelligence, perhaps we should also take some inspiration from humans in this way. And in particular, if we want robots to generalize broadly, maybe we should train them with equally broad data. Maybe we should train them in the real world, experiencing a wide range of situations, not in a lab environment. So today I'll be talking about, first, how can robots acquire broad and diverse experiences? And second, once we acquire those broad and diverse experiences, how can we develop algorithms that can learn from such data? So first, let's talk about how we can actually get, how we can allow robots to actually get broad and diverse experiences. So one first approach that we could imagine taking is have the robot collect data with random actions. This would look something like this. And we actually get surprisingly diverse and interesting interactions in this way. You can also give the robot some towels and program these same random actions, and you also get some interesting interactions as well. And the really nice thing about collecting data in this way is that we can collect a lot of data this way. The robots can run overnight, they can collect data and explore with these random actions 24/7. But the downside of this data, of course, is that it still has limited utility. The data is largely going to be limited to learning relatively simple tasks. So how might we try to collect a little bit more interesting data? One approach to collecting more interesting data would be to have a human provide some demonstrations of what interesting things to do are. For example, by guiding the robot arm through various motions. This is great because we can get pretty interesting and useful data this way. But we can't get a lot of this data because it requires a human to collect all of the data. Another approach might be to look at novelty-seeking methods. So there's actually a long history of studying exploration and curiosity in cognitive science and AI. We took one of the state-of-the-art methods called Plan to Explore that was developed actually and was published this year. Our goal was to get the robot to open one of these drawers, and specifically this drawer right here. And what we found is that if we ran this algorithm on the robot, it was able to figure out how to put its arm in kind of a diverse range of configurations, but it actually never really figured out how to interact with all the objects in the environment. It interacted with them very rarely. And with this in mind, one way to think about this is, well, when babies are kind of in environments with humans, they aren't just kind of exploring on their own. They can also see what their parents are doing, for example. And so it's reasonable to not consider a completely self-supervised approach for this problem. And so the question that we asked is, how can a person help the robot, but ideally help the robot in a way that doesn't require that person in the loop of the exploration process itself, like in the demonstration scenario? So to approach this problem, we kind of have a two-step process. First, a person shows examples of interesting states to the robot. For example, states where the robot is opening this drawer in varying configurations. This is kind of teaching the robot what are some of the interesting things that you can do in the environment. And then simultaneously, training a classifier to classify interesting examples versus data that the robot explored itself. And second, training the robot to explore to find images that are classified as interesting. So the way that this works is we basically just are kind of alternating between training this classifier and trying to explore to find the interesting things. And after less than 3 minutes of human guidance to show some examples of interesting things and running autonomous exploration, we get a policy that kind of first moves towards the drawer very quickly and eventually learns how to interact with the drawer and play with the drawer in different ways. So this is kind of a lot more interesting behavior. And we also see that if we actually mathematically, quantitatively count the number of episodes in which the robot touches the handle or moves the drawer, it's substantially larger with this more directed approach than with the approach that I mentioned previously. And really the takeaway here is that a small amount of human guidance can go a long way if the algorithms are specifically aiming to aiming to kind of leverage both their own exploration and their own autonomous experience in combination with that human guidance. Okay, so that's the kind of first step of how we can acquire broad and diverse experiences through autonomous data collection. Now, how can algorithms actually learn from this kind of data? One of the things that you may have noticed is that with this kind of data, in contrast to robots learning how to use spatulas, there's no notion of progress or success from this data. So we can't just apply reinforcement learning out of the box to this kind of data. And this is perhaps a good thing. And in particular, we aren't going to try to learn one very narrow task. We're going to try to learn something that can be used much more broadly from this data. So in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to, after we've collected this data, we're going to learn how to predict what will happen in the future. This is akin to the world models that Dan was mentioning. So we'll learn predictive models that can predict what the future will look like based on the actions the robot takes. And for different action sequences, the robot will predict the future. And in contrast to the task learning approaches that I mentioned before, these models capture general purpose knowledge about the world, about physics, about objects, and they use all of the available supervision signal. And also, because we're actually learning these models directly in pixel space, there's no assumption about task representations or about objects, which means that it's very easy to readily apply these models towards deformable objects like towels, for which there's no clear representation. Finally, the thing that I'd like to emphasize with these models is that this sort of prediction is inherently a supervised learning problem. And so you're training a neural network to predict, to kind of output future images, given the current image in your sequence of actions. And by nature of being a supervised learning problem, this means that larger models with more data will lead to better predictions. And for example, in this recent work by Ruben Villegas, he showed that if you really start scaling up these video prediction models, you can get pretty remarkable predictions from these models that are able to fairly accurately predict how these shorts will deform as you try to pick them up, and how this towel will deform as you pick it up and move it to a certain position. So I think that these models are something that's going to be particularly scalable. Now, how do we actually use these models to accomplish tasks? What we do is we plan. We come up with plans based on our model of the world that we think will achieve our desired outcomes. And the procedure for this is quite simple. So first, we consider a number of potential action sequences. Then we predict the future for each action sequence by running that action sequence through the model. Then lastly, we execute the best plan. We can optionally also replan at each time step and kind of refine the plan that we came up with before, especially if something unexpected happened. Okay, so overall, we collect data, learn a predictive model, and then plan using that model. How well does this approach work? So we took a single model. In this case, we're just going to train it on the random data that I showed before. It's a pretty large amount of random data. And we're going to plan with this single video prediction model to try to accomplish different tasks that are given to the robot at test time. So for example, one task shown here is to try to lift this stuffed animal upward. And we see that the robot can figure out how to do that using its model. Another task is to move the sleeve of this shirt over to the right. The robot can also figure out how to do this task. We can give it a task like picking up an apple and putting it onto a plate while keeping the plate stationary. And the robot can also predict the future and use its predictive model to figure out how to solve this task. And we can also give it tasks that use deformable objects, like trying to roughly move a part of the shorts upward to fold the leg of the pant. It can figure out how to maneuver an object to a different position. And it can also figure out how to cover an object using the towel. So while these skills are a lot coarser than the more complex skills like using a spatula that I showed at the beginning of the talk, and the success rate is also a bit lower, the important takeaway here is that by leveraging broader data and figuring out how to learn from broader data, we can get substantially broader generalization to many different kinds of tasks and also many different kinds of objects. So a number of these objects shown here were actually held out during the data collection process, and is able to generalize to those because the model that is trained isn't specific to one object and because it's trained on much broader data. Now, what if we have a little bit more interesting data than just random data? We can incorporate this into the process as well. So we can, for example, take the demonstration data that I showed before. This is diverse demonstration data of many different kinds of tasks, specifically using tools in different ways. We can incorporate this into the data to improve the model, the data for training the model, but we can also incorporate it into the other two steps as well. So what we'll do is we'll learn a model of the kinds of actions that the human would perform. We'll use this to collect additional data along the lines of kind of more interesting interactions. And we'll also use it to guide the planning process to consider both a range of actions that the robot considers, as well as actions from this model that might look a little bit more like what the human would have done. And by incorporating demonstrations into the model and into the planning process, we can do more interesting tasks. So we can solve new tasks that the robot didn't see in the demonstration data, such as sweeping these objects into a dustpan. We can also allow the robot to figure out how to reach an object that isn't within its reach. So in this example, we restricted the robot's arm to the green rectangle and told it to try to bring the blue object closer to itself. And it figured out that in order to accomplish that task of bringing the blue object closer to itself, it has to pick up the hook and use it to solve the task. It can also use unseen objects as tools of some sort. So it had never seen a sponge before, but it's able to figure out that by picking up the sponge and wiping it across the plate, it can use this, it can accomplish the task of moving these two red pieces off of the plate. It can also use objects such as water bottles as tools, which wouldn't conventionally be seen as a tool. And lastly, the robot can decide when to use a tool, such as when it needs to move two objects, and when not to use a tool, if it's just more efficient to move a single object that's commanded to the desired position. And the thing I'd like to emphasize here is that in all of these tasks, the robot isn't explicitly told that it should use an object as a tool. It figures that out on its own, and it figures out that the fastest way to accomplish the tasks that it's given are to use a tool, or in the last example, not to use a tool. So the takeaway here is that with more sophisticated data, this enables more sophisticated behaviors, but also without sacrificing generality. We're still able to accomplish a wide range of tasks with a single model, with a single planning procedure. Okay, so to wrap up, kind of main takeaway that I'd like to convey is that if we want robots to generalize broadly, we should think about training them with equally broad data, something that's a little bit closer to the kinds of experiences that a human experiences when they are developing. I talked about how robots can acquire broad and diverse experiences, and how a small amount of guidance and teaching from a human can go a long way. And I also talked about how we can develop algorithms that can learn from such data by learning models of the world and using those models to plan. We saw that broader data led to broader generalization, and more sophisticated data led to more sophisticated behavior. These takeaways shouldn't be kind of anything too surprising, but we can find that they actually hold in practice, and it suggests that we should be training robots on broader and more sophisticated data. And most importantly, these are steps towards robots that can generalize rather than training a robot on a single task. Now, looking to the future, I'm really interested in moving towards AI systems that can more broadly understand their world that they're in. And so I think that there's two kind of important directions towards this goal. In the context of robot learning, we've really barely scratched the surface of data scalability. I showed examples of robots learning from data with many different objects, with many different kinds of interactions. But we can still really take this substantially further by training robots in different environments with different camera viewpoints and so forth. And so towards this goal, we started to develop an open database called the RoboNet database that we want to kind of allow us to accumulate and share data across institutions, across robots. It already contains data from more than 4 institutions, data from 7 different robot platforms, and has 15 million frames in it. Beyond kind of sharing data within the robotics community, we've also started to develop algorithms that can learn by watching videos of people. Videos of people is a source of data that's just widely available on the internet and in various data sets. And if we can figure out how to learn from videos of people doing things, then we could substantially expand the sources of data that robots can learn from. And then beyond robot learning in AI more broadly, I think that we also need to be thinking about whether we can generalize beyond the data distribution. So far, one of the predominant techniques in AI is machine learning. In machine learning, we typically make this assumption that our training and test distributions are going to match, and that our data is going to be drawn IID from this distribution. And this assumption is actually pretty strong. And I think that we can actually develop different assumptions that may allow us to generalize beyond the data distribution. And we've started to explore these kinds of assumptions by developing algorithms that are robust to distribution shift and are robust to new environments by being able to quickly adapt to these new environments. Okay, and that's it. I'd like to thank my students. All the students here played a really substantial role in the work that I presented. Also, if you're interested in learning more about generalization, multitask learning, and meta learning, which I didn't actually talk too much about today, all the slides are available for the course that I teach at Stanford, CS 330. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Chelsea, for a fascinating talk. So please stay on, and I'd like to welcome back Chris, Matthew, and Dan, so that we can begin our panel discussion and take some of your questions. Again, questions can be submitted on the event page of our website. Chris, Matthew, and Dan, if you can turn your video and mic on.
My video's on, but it looks like I'm frozen in my little window. Am I moving in yours?
We can hear you, Matt. That is Matt, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but no video?
I don't see a video of you. Okay, now I see a video of you.
Oh, okay. Now, yeah, I just started moving on my own screen. Good.
Okay, I think we're good to go. So I'll start by asking the first question, which is a kind of I think a question for each of the panelists. I'll allow each of you to opine on this question. It's a very big picture question, and maybe a slightly adversarial question, right? Is if we define the moon as trying to approach general human-like intelligence, are current deep learning or other learning approaches akin to climbing a tree to get to the moon? If so, what do you think are the most important ingredients that we're missing? And if not, why do you think existing methods, maybe with slight modifications, might actually scale up to getting to general intelligence? So I think I'll let each one of you give your thoughts on that, and then we'll dive into more concrete questions. Should I call on someone?
Looks like you've stumped them already.
Yeah, I don't know the
I want to
answer.
hear what the other speakers have to say. They're going to give great answers.
Well, let's just keep it most. What do you think is the most important ingredient that we're missing at the moment, or that we need to expand on to get to more versatile artificial intelligence systems?
Can I answer that in a way that's going to turn into a question for Chelsea?
Sounds great.
So Chelsea, you ended your lovely talk by referring to richer models of the world as an objective for us now, and you talked about prediction, and oftentimes, I mean, there are some cool examples of how you can go beyond this, but oftentimes in machine learning prediction, for video is pixel level prediction, but a deeper understanding of the world seems to suggest something that isn't tied to pixels. The example that I often think of is, I know if I throw a brick at a window, it'll break, but my knowledge of that is not encoded in visual simulations of where every shard of glass would fall. So these kinds of abstractions, these kind of conceptual abstractions, they seem important. Maybe we can get by without them, or maybe they'll sort of emerge without our having to worry about them if we have enough diverse data and the right kind of architectural biases. But it seems like something worth discussing. So that's a question for actually for both you, Dan, and you, Chelsea. Like, are these kinds of abstractions important, and how do we get them?
So I can take a shot at responding to this, to I guess both of your questions. I think that in terms of getting to the moon, I feel like we haven't exited the atmosphere yet. I don't know if we're climbing a tree, but I feel like we've kind of made some progress, but are not maybe through the most important milestone there. I think that, I guess, well, first, I don't know, but I can, of course, speculate on both of these problems. I think that there are fundamental aspects of machine learning that obviously aren't going to take us all the way. One is the IID assumption that I was touching on at the very end. I think that humans can obviously, it seems like we don't have this IID assumption, and both of you know a lot more about humans than I do, but it seems like we're going to need to figure out how we can generalize beyond our training distribution in some way, and figuring out what assumptions will allow us to do that. And perhaps getting at Matt's question, I do feel like it does seem like we need better abstractions. There are certainly things about these pixel prediction models that don't work quite as well. It does seem like we haven't yet hit the limit of these models yet. Even if you make these models bigger, we get better and better predictions, and we can still substantially increase the data that we're training these models on as well. And if you take lessons from computer vision, for example, we know that as you accumulate data, or language at this point, as you accumulate data and as you train bigger models, you'll get better and better predictions and so forth. So I think that we have a lot of progress that we can continue to make with these kinds of models, but I also think that we need to figure out what will allow us to move beyond the training distribution. And abstractions may be an aspect of that.
Okay. Chris, do you want to ask a question?
Okay. I was thinking a bit about, it seemed like there was some kind of core that tied all three parts of your work together. And maybe they didn't all quite come together, but it seemed like both Dan and Matt were talking about the importance of recurrence and feedback loops, and Matt was certainly talking about meta learning and how it could be implemented in the brain, which sort of also then connects very closely to a lot of Chelsea's main work. And so I thought maybe we could talk a bit more about the center of that interaction. I mean, if I start with a sort of an easy giveaway for Dan, I mean, you mentioned the importance of having recurrent networks with your making recurrent vision networks, that there was a little box on the slide at one point saying not an LSTM, but you didn't really say anything about what kind of model of recurrence was successful and important for your visual system. So you could maybe concretely say a little bit more about that. And then sort of thinking more to Chelsea and Matt. I mean, Matt, you touched on the work about how it seems like brains will both learn quickly for fast understanding and then learn much more slowly with sort of slower reorganization. And well, you can sort of make an analogy to that, to how meta-learning systems work with an inner loop and an outer loop, but I'm kind of not really convinced that current meta-learning algorithms are working on the same kind of scale as what we're talking about when psychologists talk about human brains learning on two scales. So maybe Dan first, and we can talk about this.
Right. Well, so yeah, no, I mean, I would say recurrence is probably important. I did start with it. And it is true that, circuits that, in a recurrent circuit, it turns out that sort of basically two things that are important to make it integrate well into a deep convolutional stack. One is that it be gateable, kind of like an LSTM. That is to say, it's sort of multiplying things by, numbers between 0 and 1 in a kind of learnable way. But it should also be It should also be such that in the zero state, it actually doesn't screw up the computation the way that an LSTM does. So the LSTM zero state essentially doesn't pass through the data. And so it feeds, if you push it in, it sort of screws up the feed forward pass. So there are a couple of
So
things
you essentially want an
differences.
LSTM with a residual connection, and then
Yeah,
you'd be happy.
it's a little bit like that, except that there's a class of things that make them work that seem to work. But you know, I would actually say that I think that I'm much less impressed with the importance of recurrence than I am with something that sort of came up a little bit toward the end of Chelsea's answer to Matt's question, which is, or to Surya's question, one or the other, which is like, what are the things that actually need to be built in to actually be able to, like, say, learn prediction with like reasonable amounts of data, and like, what are the right latents that you're going to use to make predictions work that are not going to be pixels? And so, you know, in the part of the work that I talked about that I probably went over too fast, I apologize for that. What I think is most important, perhaps, in this is this sort of physical scene graph idea, you know, where you can have a sort of unified, like 3D, it's somewhere between a unified 3D computer vision problem and a symbolic computation. Like, how do you represent scenes with objects in them in such a way that you can have the richness that Chelsea was asking for, while having them be learnable in a flexible way and not be sort of bound to particular, very kind of like hokey, like toy concepts of objects. And I think that figuring out what those intermediates are, such that you get good latents for forward prediction, is really one of the key missing things. And, you know, I feel like, you know, if I were to pick between the importance of recurrence and the importance of physical scene graphs and methods for understanding those, I would actually be much more bullish about the importance of the second one. Although it is actually true that you do need, or seem to benefit a lot from, recurrent computation in computing the scene, because basically you really would like to combine high resolution, low level features and abstract high level features and together to get good understandings of the objects and the way they're related to each other. And of course, that is well expressed by a recurrent network, convolutional recurrent network. You know, so I mean, recurrence comes in there.
Okay, maybe we should get a few thoughts from Matt or Chelsea.
Oh, sorry, I just want to say one thing about space.
Okay.
We are climbing a tree, and we should be, because we should be climbing the evolutionary tree.
Oh,
Good twist.
Matt. Can I just add to that, because I mainly want to agree, and then I think I'm going to bring up something that may represent a difference of opinion between Dan and me on the one hand and Chelsea on the other. So I'm going to throw this to Chelsea. Recurrence. I want to kind of double down on what Dan was saying about the role of recurrence in something like graph representation. Of course, graph nets are recurrent networks. What recurrence is doing there is not what it's traditionally done in most applications of LSTMs, which is temporal integration, integrating across like words in a sentence, or it's integrating across elements that might exist simultaneously in a display or in a graph-like structure. And to me, this is holy grail stuff, because I'm one of these people who thinks that compositionality is really essential to cognition, and looking for ways that deep learning systems can compute in a compositional manner seems totally fundamental. I'm a big fan of transformers because they have a kind of built-in scheme of individual elements that are then modulated by their context. And of course, you can. Yeah, go ahead.
For a fine point here, I mean, you know, from a formal theory point of view, there's this shift from true recurrence, where it's infinite, it keeps on going along, and regardless of whether you're looking at typical things like graph convolutional neural networks and graph neural network or transformers, we're saying, oh, forget about that. Providing you can do a few steps of integration, you can do pretty well. So is that sort of the position you're advocating?
You know, I don't know. Maybe there's an approximation story here that will get us where we want to go. So I don't know. I'd like to hear what Dan has to say about that.
Well, like, I mean, basically, you know, it's a very complicated. Let me put it this way. I do think that the key question is which particular bias you should be using, and the bias you have when you build an recurrent network in the sort of standard sense is like something like, let's say, I don't know, maybe LSTMs, and the bias when you're building, graph network is like something that like basically does adjacency matrix computations, and then when you're building a transformer, it is indeed a kind of RNN but with a different kind of bias, and so I don't know that I would say that like I have a clear opinion of which one is the right one in every context. I think that's really going to shake out based on how things perform, and if it turns out that there's one structure that's good for everything, well, that would be really cool to find out. And this goes back to the question of how you climb the evolutionary tree, because you really want something to not be too complicated, right? It's got to be able to arise by climbing a tree, right? That actually has to happen in a way. Maybe one thing that I would add is that graph networks are very interesting to me, and transformers are very interesting. And I think they've allowed us to get some very powerful results in the sort of physical scene graph domain, and others obviously as well. One thing that is true is that if you're going to make the map to the brain, you have to have a fixed number of units, because the brain doesn't change the number of neurons with different scenes, right? So at the end of the day, there's got to be like a physical machine that has like a fixed number of units that sit there that is actually doing the thing. And so at the end of the day, even if it's a graph network, a graph neural network is in some sense not a neural network, right? Because like it allows you to have like different numbers of nodes on different inputs, which is very, very excellent from an abstraction point of view. It's excellent, but it's terrible from the point of view of actually making a brain mapping, because you break this basic principle that like the units should correspond kind of to the units, right? And so there has to be a way of titrating it so that you end up with a thing with a fixed number of units that actually computes the abstraction. And of course, in a certain sense, whenever you implement a graph neural network on a GPU, you're doing that. There's like an operation like indexing, which basically squeezes out the zeros to the end, and like those are not the nodes.
And you could say that the transformer networks are like that, right? Because they are a fixed structure, not the graph neural network idea.
Exactly. So I think that's what I was winding up to, is that we need to be probably biased towards things that have that property to them.
Okay, shall we get a few thoughts from Chelsea? Or Matt wanted to jump in. Matt.
I just wanted to say we might be able to gain some insight from neuroscience and psychology here, because there's plenty of evidence that, from multi-object tracking studies, that the human brain is capable of tracking a very limited number of objects, and maybe that's a reflection of how many. It's not a reflection of a limited number of neurons. It's a functional level limitation, and maybe that's a good bottleneck for us to have. The question I was going to ask Chelsea was: it sounds like she's not on board for this graph representation. Chelsea, some of the things you said made it sound like you don't want to build systems that are endowed with some a priori notion of what objects are. You want enough data that'll emerge spontaneously. Is that how you think about it?
I am not. I guess I don't like being dogmatic about these sorts of things. We haven't yet seen evidence that like the more object-centric approaches really scale to diverse scenes, to complex objects and interactions and so forth. If there was more evidence for that, then I would be all on board with using them. I think I'm a very kind of empirical, or I like to see what works and go with that. And it seems like whenever we try to impose a certain representation on top of neural networks, it seems like so far that hasn't really panned out to big successes in comparison to approaches that try to recover the representation themselves.
Well, we'll hear from Josh Tenenbaum at the end of the day. So yeah, we might get new perspectives on that as well there. Actually, this is all this discussion is pertinent to a question that was asked by the audience, and I'll expand on. Basically, the question was, how do attention-based models compare with recurrent neural networks from a biological perspective? And just to expand on it, so for example, transformers are doing very well in language. Very recently, they're doing quite well in vision. So is there good performance alone an argument for comparing representations of transformer architectures to representations of the brain? And more generally, what would you conclude if they match even better than recurrent networks? And more generally even, are there sort of criteria other than performance and representational match that we should use to ascertain the success of whether a machine can compare accurately to a brain? I think this might be more for Matt and Dan, because you spend more time comparing machines to brains.
Dan, all you.
I actually second the idea of not being dogmatic in the sense that, like, as long as there's some way to define a mapping class where units look like units, then I'm willing to try whatever approach and see which one best matches the brain, essentially. You know, like, so I mean, I don't know how to separate in some clear line test way, like biological recurrence or from, you know, transformers, from RNNs. Like, they're all related to each other in a kind of computational way, and in some sense there may even be computational universality that allows you to say always recast one in terms of the other. Really, the questions are like quantitative, like, you know, given a certain amount of training data and a certain task, like, you know, and a given amount of data used to make the mapping between the brain and the model, how well do they match on new instances? And it's really an empirical question. You know, the one thing I would say is that, like, whatever the model is, it's got to be able to actually stand in relationship to the brain the way any other brain does. So that's my bottom line, is that the mapping between the model and the brain should resemble in form, should be computable on the same data as data recorded from another animal of the same species, let's say, right? So in the case of like neural recordings, electrophysiology, it's like you've got a data matrix, which is like stimuli by neurons or neural sites in the recording. And, you know, you have data that come tensorial shape that come out like that from a neural network, if it's indeed a real fixed size neural network. And you can ask, do mappings that map one brain to another using the same mapping class. How well do you do in trying to map the brain with a neural network? And as long as you have that there, you can compare them, and maybe it'll turn out that one or the other structure is better. And presumably the core thing will be, are the structures that perform best, and on what do they perform best, are also the ones that match the brain best? That's the big question, right? Do those things coincide? Therefore, I guess I would say the only criteria is, can you actually write down the mapping in the same way as you would if you were mapping an animal to animal? And that's where I think the discussion somewhere between transformers and RNNs is a little more natural than, say, just graph neural networks as such. Although graph neural networks are easy for us to think about as programmers in a sense. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's got to work on the real world tasks. And I think that point emerging from our previous discussion is actually super critical. If we're going to impose structure, they better not be so ornery in their nature that you can't get them to work and in fact surpass the other things on real world tasks. That's the critical point. Chelsea has high standards, and we should meet those standards with our new structures. That's the key thing.
Okay.
I'll just quickly add, I think there's a paper from Ev Fedorenko's lab on bioarchive specifically looking at whether representations from transformers do a better job than baseline models on fMRI data. I think that group reached a positive conclusion. I haven't read that paper in detail yet, though.
Yeah,
Dan,
that's great work. That's led by Martin Schrimpf and I think that they found that for looking at basically language areas, GPT-2, they didn't test GPT-3, but GPT-2 is substantially better than alternatives, and it's also better at the task. So again, those things seem to go together. It's like we're climbing the evolutionary tree, Surya, right? That's what we're doing.
Let me ask a follow-up question, which is in a way staying on the same theme, since transformers and GPT-2-3 have already come up. And maybe I'll start this one with Chelsea. So, I mean, you had some more sophisticated messages in your talk, but the most simplistic message was, we just need to train our systems on much broader data. And I think, in some sense, that's a difference between necessarily something like robotics, where the sort of starting point is you've got one robot that you're training to do one thing, and natural language processing, which is where I spend my life, because, long before neural nets became cool again, right? That there's at least 40 years of history that everyone knows that the best way to produce some natural language component, whether it's doing question answering or something simple like parsing, if you want it to perform well in general, you want to train it on broad data, because that just gives you an easy generalization. But I mean, if we try and like, how much is that the solution? I mean, if we try and connect it back to child learning again, I mean, one of the things that child psychologists have noted is that actually kids are learning these skills not on broad data, right? Depending on the family, most families might only have 2 spatulas, or you've only got one set of colored blocks to play with in your pen, and yet somehow that's a way that kids can generalize. So what does that say about what we should be doing for building our AI learning systems?
Yeah, so I think that you're absolutely right in that fields like natural language processing and computer vision have already figured out how to use really broad data sets. I think that in this respect, robotics and embodied learning is very far behind other aspects of machine learning because we haven't yet figured out how best to actually collect large data sets and learn from those large data sets. And I think it's a message that the reinforcement learning community really needs to hear, because if you look at the kinds of environments that people train on, they're like this little like half cheetah thing in a 2D world with it's just like a plane is like the entire world. And we need to be thinking more fundamentally about like, can we bring robotics and embodied learning into the kind of modern ages of machine learning and deep learning and figure out how to actually generalize and train these in more interesting and complex and diverse environments. So I think that in many ways, just robotics and reinforcement learning is very far behind and needs to catch up a bit. I also agree that it's not just a matter of scaling up. I think that the failure cases of GPT-3 suggest that even when you scale up to large data, large models, and so forth, there are still cases where these models fail in unintuitive ways that are different from how humans fail. And that gets into my last point about figuring out how to go beyond the data distribution and figuring out what sort of assumptions we can bring into the machine learning process and into the system that will allow it to generalize broadly. And I think that's where most of machine learning needs to go.
But you know, if I push a little bit more on that, I mean, isn't perhaps, you know, couldn't you make an argument that actually no, there isn't a, it's not that robotics learning is way behind, you're actually where you should be, right? Because I mean, I think the facts are for kids, you know, if I think slightly bigger kids than babies, you know, if I have my 5, 7, 9-year-old and I take anything that they haven't seen before, you know, whether it's this is how you flip a pancake or this is how you use a corkscrew to open a wine bottle, though they shouldn't be opening wine bottles at the age of 7 and 9. You know, I can demonstrate that with, you know, one pan and one spatula, and well, okay, they need to try pancake flipping slightly subtle, so they need to practice a few times before they can do it well. But it's not that what they need practice flipping, but then they don't need practice of having to learn with different spatulas, right?
Yeah, and I will argue, like, I guess my message isn't to train these robot systems on 1,000 spatulas. And the systems that we were training on the end, they aren't, they're trained on kind of a really diverse range of objects. Like we just buy a bunch of objects on Amazon or at the dollar store or whatever and give them to the robots. We don't give it like 100 spatulas and 100 whatever. It's more kind of like the transpose of that, where we give it a lot of objects and a few instances per object. So I think that in general, even in the direction that we're moving towards is still towards the kinds of experiences that human children have. The kind of where we were, I think 5 years ago, was literally one or two objects, one environment, one like viewpoint, one room, which is like, I mean, it may be kind of unthinkable from people who aren't in robotics, but that's kind of where we were. And I think that we're moving towards something that looks more like where the kinds of data that children experience.
Okay.
Actually,
yeah.
I have a question that relates to this. This also comes from the audience. They actually asked, you know, how do you teach machines to generalize to out-of-sample distributions? A common one in robotics in your world, Chelsea, of course, is that, you know, it's hard to train robots in the real world. So there's a lot of effort in training robots in simulated environments and then transferring the control policies from simulation to the real world. And that's an important sort of transfer where a lot of algorithms fail and it's sort of out of distribution. What's your take on those approaches? What specifically do you think are sort of promising approaches to deal with out-of-sample distribution training or testing, and especially in the transfer from simulation to real world?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to avoid the simulation to real transfer. I think that in some ways it's a fairly pathological problem because there's a really substantial shift between our simulators and the real world, just because we actually don't have great models of physics. Physics is really complicated, and that's kind of one. And second, actually building rich simulated worlds takes a lot of effort in engineering. And in contrast, we can get a really interesting, rich and interesting world by just putting robots in our real world, right? And so if we can figure out how to store data, how to allow robots to collect experience and learn from that experience, then we don't have to solve the sim to real transfer problem. That said, of course, there is still this problem of handling distribution shift. The robot will enter a new room, it will encounter new objects, it will want to do something new that it hadn't done before. I think there are promising approaches in the robustness literature and the domain adaptation literature that tries to solve this problem. It's also an area that we're actively working on ourselves, where instead of trying to be robust to distribution shift, we try to really quickly adapt to distribution shift. But it's really an extremely active area of research, and a couple of the works that I mentioned on my last slide are trying to go in that direction.
Matt, do you have any thoughts about how we do more human-like out of distribution transfer?
Well, I mean, I think meta learning or some of the principles that come up in meta learning are relevant. You can learn how to generalize, and of course, there's plenty of work from images to continuous control taking that kind of strategy. And ultimately, it's hard to answer this question without kind of defaulting to bland statements about priors and how we need priors. There is one problem that I thought of, Chelsea, as you were making your comments, and something about the way you phrased your original question, Chris, which is about continual learning. And this might have been actually on Surya. You had that very nice list in your opening comments of like open problems where we might gain some insight from neuroscience because we just don't know how to do anything relevant in AI. And I think this is one additional case. The ability that humans have to learn something new, to utilize that information immediately, and also to retrieve it much later. So, a child, I don't know whether children still play with these things, but when I was a kid, the Jack in the Box was a very common object, and the first time you see somebody turn that crank and then the whatever it is comes out the top, you just need to experience that once and you'll be able to predict what's going to happen the next time you see that thing, even if it's 5 days later. So there's a really deep stability plasticity problem that the brain is solving there, integrating dramatically new information without disrupting long-term knowledge. I simply don't think we are even grappling with this in our machine learning projects much. We still cling to this kind of train test paradigm, which is just there's no such separation in human intelligence.
I completely agree with that. I think that in AI, we feel like we're in this paradigm where we're just going to deploy a static model. That's it, like it's done. But in the real world, you can't do that. And actually, in industry, people don't actually do that either. They are continuously training their models at various companies because they need to grapple with distribution shift. And we need to, in the machine learning research and AI research field, we need to actually keep that in mind when we're developing algorithms and move out of this train test regime towards something that's like a continuously evolving test set.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's continual learning is a fundamental problem, I think. Let's see. So along those lines, another question that came from the audience, and I'll expand upon it. Oftentimes when we're trying to create models of the brain, we obtain our networks through learning rules that are not necessarily biologically plausible, like backpropagation, though Matthew, you work on reinforcement learning. And these networks aren't subject to biological constraints. So how do we think about comparing those networks to the brain? What are the ways forward to bake in more biological constraints What are the ways forward to more biologically plausible learning rules, and might they help with these issues of continual learning? You know, is there a bridge that we can construct from our knowledge of biological learning rules to continual learning?
Well, you know, I mean, that was the one thing that I punted on in my list of 4 problems: architecture, task, data set. You know, those are the things actually we've mostly talked about as a group of speakers here. There's that 4th thing, which is the actual procedure for how do you update your parameters given the things you've seen. So I would say that, like, figuring out more biologically correct versions of learning rules is an important computational and theoretical neuroscience problem. I actually basically think it will not change anything from an AI perspective. I think biology has been particularly unproductive, and neuroscience has been particularly unable to provide insight into better learning rules. It's been great or pretty good on architecture. Cognitive science has been great on task. It tells us a lot about what the data should be, although, as Chelsea said, you know, it's challenging to actually get the robot into the environments, but it's clear what should be done there, kind of. But where I think neuroscience has been actually quite poor is telling us learning rules that are helpful at all. I mean, like the standard stuff coming out of neuroscience is just totally failure, it seems to me. You know, in terms of actually making learning rules that are good. So, you know, my bet is that, like, if there's going to be better learning rules that work, they're not going to be coming from an obvious place of biological insight. Although making learning rules that are more biologically plausible is a real theoretical neuroscience and computational neuroscience problem. But I doubt it will. My bet is that will not add to the AI conversation much at all.
Why do you think that is? I mean, you know, I'm speaking as maybe the person who knows the least about neuroscience, but, you know, brains seem pretty good at learning. You don't think that there's something useful to discover there?
I think it's incredibly.
I mean, yeah, like Matt was talking about how effective the dopamine was for implementing learning, right? I don't know.
I think it's incredibly difficult to observe the events taking place that are equivalent to, say, learning parameters in the visual system or something. So the biology is especially black box there. You know, it's like people complain about neuroscience, about deep nets being black boxes, but actually it's the brain that's the black box. And where is the box worst? Where is the darkness hardest to see through? In architecture, you can kind of see, you know, from anatomy what it looks like, and, you know, in the task you observe the behavior, right? But learning rules is the place where it's like the most inscrutable. How you would ever know what is going on by watching the changes. It's just really difficult to do that. And so, you know, I think that's like a functional reason why neuroscience has been so bad at actually telling us good learning rules. That's the part that really did come from, you know, if ConNets came from thinking about the visual system, I think that is probably partially true. You know, and if ImageNet came from thinking about cognition, you know, as Fei-Fei talks about, that's clearly true. But, like, you know, the backprop really didn't come from vision, and all the biologists are screaming about how unright it is from a biology point of view, but the alternatives that they present are just trash.
All we got is Hebbian learning. Yeah. What do you think, Matt? Are you similarly pessimistic there, or?
Not quite so pessimistic. I'm not holding my breath for biology to yield insights into learning that will immediately revolutionize AI. I do wish I knew what learning rule the brain uses, and I'm a little bit more optimistic than it sounds like Dan is, mainly because of the revolution in methods that's occurred recently in neuroscience. I just feel like the kind of limitations on what we've learned about synaptic learning rules in brains are partially a reflection of the limited tools that neuroscientists have had up until recently to actually probe what's happening during learning. But with the advent of, you know, calcium imaging and optogenetics and all sorts of crazy new things that people can do in neuroscience, it seems to me like maybe we can take the next step to understanding what's going on, at least in rodent brains. It would be great if we could study human brains. That frustrates me a lot that we can't. But the one thing I'll add is that I feel like on many fronts, if AI is gonna benefit from neuroscience, it's gonna have to prime the pump. people from AI are going to have to go to people in neuroscience and say, this is what we really wish we knew. And because in many cases, those questions are very interesting to neuroscientists. The neuroscientists just haven't thought about it, because especially the ones who are working on these crazy new methods, because they're busy being methods engineers. So these kinds of partnerships can be incredibly powerful. And it's one thing that we're trying to pursue in my group at DeepMind. So I started off thinking about neuroscience-inspired AI, but these days I often think about AI-inspired neuroscience inspired AI, that we're going to have to go to neuroscience, give them questions that they can pursue that are also of neuroscientific interest, and that's how we'll get answers back that may be useful in AI.
Yeah,
just a speculation.
Yeah, I wanted to totally agree here and chime in. I mean, one of the methods that's actually I find quite exciting that an experimental collaborative of mine is actually working on is voltage imaging of multiple synapses in the hippocampus while the mouse is learning, right? So we can start to do systems identification of how multiple synapses change during learning. And I do think that both neurobiologists have been hamstrung by their methods, but also machine learning people have been hamstrung or seduced by the allure of backpropagation, right? We know that learning in the brain is much more local, and there might be completely different theoretical frameworks that are much harder to deal with. For example, you might have different modular subsystems where individual synapses in different subsystems undergo different learning rules, but they work together, say through the framework of differential games, where each one is solving its own little interacting game, and then the whole system comes to a Nash equilibrium. And that mathematics is much more difficult to understand. And so because we've been seduced by backpropagation, we in AI are not going in that direction. And synaptic physiologists are not thinking about game theory. And so this dialogue needs to happen, right? I think the truth is much stranger than what we actually kind of currently understand. And so I really like this idea of, and I've talked about this before also, AI-inspired neuroscience inspiring AI, right? We have to go backwards where AI people really talk to neuroscientists and influence the experiments that they do, right?
Yeah.
That's important.
Look, don't get me wrong. I think that the question of figuring out what's going on and learning in the brain is very interesting. Like I say, I think there's a great experimental, theoretical, computational neuroscience question there. I think that's really true. Where I would say I'm particularly skeptical is that what's going to come out of that is going to be, in the short term, or maybe even the medium term, enough better than first order methods that we currently have that like it's going to really help us do better in AI. Like in AI, the problem that we're having is not really an optimization problem, right? Like if there was a huge freaking optimization problem, then totally, there would maybe be a big space for the new thing to come in and like totally revolutionize something. But actually we're not having an optimization problem, right? We're having an architectural bias problem. We're having a question of what is the task and the environment.
Just to interject really quickly, Dan, because it's on point. I agree with you, we're not having an optimization problem, but we are having a generalization problem, right? And
but again, is that going to be something that
modular biological architectures with limited learning rules, those limitations may actually help with generalization.
So one other thing I'd like to add here is I agree that we have pretty good optimizers and learning rules, but one thing, at least from the embodied learning and robotics standpoint, that we have kind of not a lot of idea, and I'd love to hear insights from neuroscience, is what should the learning signal be beyond the learning rule? So we have things like curiosity and so forth, but like what sort of supervision should we be providing to AI systems? How should I communicate with my robot? How should I tell it what I want it to learn, what tasks it should do, like beyond exploration and so forth? How can it figure out how to do a variety of useful tasks and complete those tasks and so forth? On the robotic side, there's kind of no clear answer to this problem. And also in the machine learning standpoint, like we have supervised learning, we have self-supervised learning, but still we don't really know what the learning signal should be.
Oh yeah, but figuring out totally agree. And that's my point, is that like, there's a big space open in terms of what should the learning signal be. From the point of view of how, once you know what the signal it is, to convert it into changes on the parameters to get the system to do it. That's the learning rule. I think there's not that's not the big pressing gap from an AI perspective. It's a great theoretical neuroscience question. How does the brain do that? But from on the AI side, I think that the gap is smaller there. It's more like what you're saying is like, what should the signal be? And, I'm all for, I think that that's going to be where a huge amount of progress is made on the AI side, and maybe inspired in many cases by cognition. So I mean, I think there's a good loop there.
Yeah, just to give an example, like one place where we thought we had made a lot of progress was sort of reward prediction error and reinforcement learning being a learning signal, and we see a signature of it in dopamine. But then the story is getting much, much more complex, right? Matt touched on it with distributional reinforcement learning. That field is heating up in the fly system, where they show that the dopamine signals coming into the analog of the basal ganglia of the fly signals almost every single aspect of task performance. And that may be better understood through a multitask learning signal that's very high dimensional as opposed to a very low dimensional reward signal. And so I think neuroscience is starting to progress there. But again, the onus is upon us to talk to neuroscientists and say, like Chelsea, say, hey, this is the problem we're having. What could the learning signal be? Matt, you probably have ideas on this because you've thought about reinforcement learning and so forth.
Well, my thoughts on this lead in a somewhat different direction, which is connected with the very last thing I said in my presentation about social science and human-centered AI. So, deep reinforcement learning research started off with games, and there's a reason for that, which is that we know what the reward function is in a game. What's the reward function for Atari? Points. What's the reward function for Go? Win. What happens when you try to move beyond the world of games? It becomes much more difficult to specify the reward function. So if you want to do reinforcement learning, you've got a big problem specification challenge. And by the way, this comes up even in tasks like the ones that you might want a robot to perform. For example, imitation. What counts as a good imitation? I'm not the first person to ask that. There are whole literatures on this. But I think if you sit with this problem long enough and kind of like honest with yourself, the only answer that makes any sense is human preference. Like a good imitation is whatever a human thinks is a good imitation. And I think in the end, the answer that I'm interested in when it comes to the question of where does the feedback come from? I think humans are really the only reasonable source. But that leads to all sorts of other problems. Human feedback's hugely expensive. Chelsea, you pointed that out. And human preferences are notoriously complicated and contradictory. And God forbid you should have to satisfy more than one human when those humans might disagree. So this is one reason that I'm really interested in things like social choice theory now, behavioral economics. I think what's waiting for us, down the line in the path where we're at the top of the tree that we're climbing is that kind of problem specification problem, which is going to lead us back to human feedback. That's just my way
that makes
out.
sense. I think that one question along those lines too is beyond kind of human feedback for specifying like things we want it to do, what sort of human interaction can support and structure the learning process itself? So when children learn, there are parents and so forth that can help them learn about the world beyond their own experiences. And so there's the things that like your parents want you to do, but there's also the things that your parents do that help you learn and help you develop. So what are the things that are helpful? We can't just have a robot kind of on its own learning. It probably needs some sort of parents to structure that learning process and scaffold it. And so I think that's also another open question is what sort of interactions, what sort of world do these agents need to live in order to develop appropriately into intelligent beings?
The idea of needing robot parents seems a very interesting one. But before we quite get to the robot parents, for what kind of world do these robots need to live in? I thought I could ask a bit more about that. You already, Chelsea, earlier in the previous answer said the word embodied. So looking at that a bit, I mean, so you mentioned at the end of your talk the RoboNet database that you've been involved in, and maybe this is a bit crude to say, but my impression is that if I look around at places like sort of vision and robotics groups, that at the moment everybody is building some kind of network world simulator, something to be able to do have these bigger supplies of data and do more. But I mean, what's actually necessary for that to be useful? So like a couple of the questions I don't actually know much about RoboNet, but a couple of the questions you could wonder is, how much do we need more of the rich multisensory experience of our embodied biological agents? Can you let someone asked in the questions, can you grasp the concept of water without feeling water? And then secondly, I mean, for little kids learning, clearly, manipulating stuff themselves is super, super important, all the evidence suggests. And that leads to this the famous idea of the scientist in the crib, right? That if you can manipulate, you can do your own experiments and learn about things like causality. So, is it actually useful collecting up a huge amount of footage of robots doing things? Is it sufficient to have a virtual world? What do we actually need?
I think that from the data standpoint, we don't know. And I think that we are kind of simultaneously developing data sets and algorithms and figuring out how the algorithms can learn from these large data sets, what sort of data sets they thrive from, and so forth. I think it's kind of a developing question, an open question, and so forth. With regard to your question of the importance of being embodied, it seems like this is probably going to be pretty important, at least from my standpoint. I think that one of the ways that we may be able to get beyond the train test, like assuming that the train test distribution have to be the same in machine learning, is by being able to probe your environment and being able to run experiments and seeing what outcomes that leads to. And it seems like basically when you're actually are making the assumption that you have an embodied agent in the world, there are various assumptions like experimentation and so forth that may allow you to generalize beyond your training distribution. And one very natural thing that you could do there is just you can control your data distribution essentially, and so you can structure your data distribution in a way that more reflects the kinds of things that you might see going forward. This also connects to continual learning, like we were talking about before, where you're just continuously collecting new data and learning from it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a big part of this that has to do with what is the policy of the agent gathering the data. When we talk about babies like playing with objects, like you mentioned, Chris, it's a very non-random set of things that they do when they're interacting with the objects to learn how they're going to operate. And then actually, I think that in the context of the kind of imitation learning that Matt was talking about, it's even more important. Is how do you get a baby to actually know that what it should pay attention to in the world is the interesting stuff that its parents are doing, right? I mean, that's like a very non-trivial policy for the baby to intrinsically know how to execute, is how to separate all the stuff that's irrelevant from the stuff that isn't, given the utter infinitude of possible things that it could actually do and ways that it can allocate its attention essentially. And so, I think we shouldn't forget, it's not just about embodying them in the environment, that there's a real policy and intrinsic motivation data gathering problem there. And, all three of us talked about various approaches to that we've been working on in different ways, but that especially becomes important, I think, in the multi-agent social context. What is the intrinsic motivation underlying social interaction?
Yeah, actually, this connects. So I completely agree. I think it's a profound observation, of course, that babies actively decide their data distribution in interesting ways that may be guided by innate evolution initially. But related to this, actually, Bill Newsom asked this question specifically to you, Dan. I think you had mentioned at some point that the agent gets bored, and Bill wanted to ask you, what does it mean when you say the agent gets bored? What is boredom in a digital agent? And also, you didn't get a chance to get into this, but how does curiosity, this is kind of a second follow-up question, how does curiosity aid social interactions among multiple agents? But let's start with the boredom one.
Yeah, boredom just means that the distribution of actions that the agent decides to take is shifting. So, essentially what you see in those kinds of systems is a kind of stage-like progression where the data distribution shifts fairly quickly and stays with something for a while. And boredom is essentially the time when that shift occurs, because, for example, its loss has gotten too low. If your loss function is something like, I'm going to do things that are going to challenge me, then when you're doing things that have become, when you're first doing those things, they're challenging and they're quote interesting, you'll keep doing them. But at some point, if the system is working right, and it's hard to get them to work right, but if they do work right, then you get to the point where, you've essentially juiced the thing that you're doing, and you need to look for something that's going to take you to the next step. And that's where I put quotes around boredom, because this is a digital agent and who knows what anything really is. But it's sort of intuitively, in a vague sense, the idea that you want to shift your actions to get to something that's going to teach yourself something more, right? So those are the moments when I think it looks bored, basically. Although of course you have to discount that for the fact that we very naturally want to anthropomorphize the systems we build. At least that's a challenge, and all of us have to prevent.
Next time he tells me he's bored, I'll tell him just shift the distribution of your inputs. We'll see how that goes. He's 5 years old. We'll see.
Does Matt have a final thought? He wants to contribute to this.
I agree with almost everything that's been said. I'm wrestling a lot with the embodiment question right now. That's something that DeepMind has kind of operated on, that has had that as the default, maybe because vision was one of the first things that kind of worked in deep learning. But the recent progress in language modeling has a lot of us discussing, well, how far could you get just with symbolic data, and what more do you get from embodied action? And I think the answer to that is simply language refers to a world, and a world is a different observation and action space. And if you want to gain knowledge through the experimental method and actually acquire new knowledge through that channel, you have to have access to that world to which language is referring. But I think we're in a spot now where a lot of people are asking, well, how much knowledge can we nonetheless inject into even our embodied agents, given language? Gosh knows, humans have a lot of knowledge injected through that channel. So I think it's an interesting new discussion.
Yeah.
Sounds good. So we're at our break points. I just wanted to thank all our speakers for fantastic talks, a scintillating discussion. We're going to take a half-hour break, and we're going to restart on another Zoom. We're going to restart the live stream at 12 p.m. Pacific time, and we'll have another set of speakers and 2 panel discussions after that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.